Grizzly bear mauls, sheriff and deputy during traffic stop, April 1st, 2025. The Montana wilderness had never felt more alive than it did on the morning of April 1st, 2025, when Sheriff Robert Eugene Lane pulled his weathered Crown Victoria patrol car into the gravel parking area beside Highway 2, just 14 miles northwest of Kalispell. The sun hung low over the Flathead Valley, casting long shadows through the towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that lined both sides of the two-lane highway like silent sentinels. At 50 years old, Sheriff Lane had patrolled these roads for over 2 decades. But something about this particular morning felt different, charged with an electricity he couldn't quite name, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. Deputy Christopher Michael Owens, 31 years old with sandy brown hair and the kind of earnest blue eyes that still held traces of the idealism that had brought him to law enforcement 6 years earlier, adjusted the radio on his shoulder as he climbed out of the passenger seat. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the faint musk of wildlife that always seemed to permeate the forests surrounding Kalispell. Chris had grown up in these mountains, had learned to track deer before he could properly tie his shoes, and yet even his trained senses couldn't detect the massive predator that was already watching them from the tree line, its dark eyes calculating and patient. Sheriff Lane stretched his back, feeling the familiar ache that came from too many years behind the wheel and too many nights spent hunched over paperwork. His graying mustache twitched as he surveyed the stretch of highway before them, a notorious speed trap where drivers coming down from the mountain passes often lost track of their velocity, lulled by the straight stretch of asphalt and the breathtaking view of Flathead Lake shimmering in the distance. Robert had been born and raised in Flathead County, had seen it transform from a sleepy logging community into a destination for wealthy out-of-state transplants seeking their piece of Montana paradise. He'd married his high school sweetheart Sarah 32 years ago, and together they'd raised 2 children who had long since moved to cities with more opportunities than rural Montana could provide. The radio crackled to life, dispatcher Angela Martinez's voice cutting through the morning stillness. All units, be advised we have reports of increased bear activity along Highway 2 between mile markers 47 and 52. Fish, Wildlife and Parks has issued an advisory. Use caution in those areas. Angela had been the voice on the other end of the radio for nearly 15 years. And both Robert and Chris had come to rely on her steady professionalism and encyclopedic knowledge of every back road and hidden danger in their jurisdiction. Chris keyed his radio. Unit 7, acknowledging bear advisory. We're currently positioned at mile marker 49. Robert nodded grimly. Spring was always the most dangerous time for human bear encounters in northwestern Montana. The grizzlies emerged from their winter dens, hungry and irritable, their usual food sources often still buried under late snow. Fish, Wildlife and Parks had documented 37 bears in the immediate area around Kalispell, including at least 4 large male grizzlies whose territories overlapped with the highway corridor. The largest of these, a massive boar that wildlife biologists had designated Bear 247, weighed an estimated 800 pounds and had been involved in multiple property damage incidents over the past 2 years. What neither Robert nor Chris knew was that Bear 247 had been tracking their movements for the past 20 minutes. The enormous grizzly had been foraging in a patch of huckleberry bushes roughly 200 yards from the highway when the distinctive sound of the patrol car's engine had caught his attention. Bears possess hearing that is roughly twice as sensitive as that of humans, and 247 had learned to associate the particular frequency of law enforcement vehicles with increased human activity, something that often meant competition for food sources or direct threats to his territory. The bear's massive frame, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder even on all fours, moved through the undergrowth with a silence that seemed impossible for an animal of his size. His thick, chocolate-brown fur showed the scars of countless territorial battles, and his dark eyes held the cold intelligence that had allowed him to survive 12 years in some of the most challenging wilderness in North America. Spring hunger gnawed at his belly, the result of a winter den that had been disturbed twice by backcountry skiers, forcing him to relocate and burning precious fat reserves in the process. The morning sun climbed higher as Robert and Chris settled into their routine patrol positions. Robert positioned himself near the rear of the patrol car with the radar gun, while Chris took up position near the front bumper with the citation book and his own handheld radar device. This particular stretch of Highway 2 had been responsible for 17 serious accidents in the past 3 years, most of them involving drivers who had allowed the scenic beauty of the landscape to distract them from the reality of mountain driving. The speed limit dropped from 70 to 45 miles per hour as the road curved around Flathead Lake, but many drivers missed the signs or simply ignored them. At 9:17 a.m., a dust-covered Ford F-350 pickup truck came racing around the curve, its engine roaring as the driver downshifted to maintain speed through the turn. Robert's radar gun immediately locked onto the vehicle, displaying 73 miles per hour in the 45 zone. "That's our customer," Robert muttered, already moving toward the patrol car's driver's seat, while Chris jogged to the passenger side. The pursuit was brief but intense. The Ford's driver, later identified as Marcus Joseph Kellerman, a 34-year-old contractor from Whitefish, initially seemed intent on outrunning the patrol car. His truck kicked up a cloud of dust and gravel as he accelerated through a series of sharp turns, but Robert's decades of experience with mountain pursuit driving allowed him to maintain visual contact even as the speedometer in the Crown Victoria climbed past 80 miles per hour. Chris gripped the dashboard as they navigated a particularly sharp turn, the patrol car's tires squealing against the asphalt. "He's slowing down," Chris observed, watching as the Ford's brake lights flashed repeatedly. Sure enough, Marcus had apparently thought better of his decision to flee and was now pulling onto the narrow shoulder of the highway, approximately 2 miles from their original position. The location where Marcus chose to stop would later be described by investigators as tactically challenging. The shoulder was barely wide enough to accommodate both vehicles, with a steep embankment dropping away on the right side and dense forest pressing close to the left edge of the asphalt. A small creek ran parallel to the highway about 50 feet down the embankment, and the sound of running water created a constant background noise that would prove significant in the events that followed. Robert activated the patrol car's emergency lights and carefully positioned the Crown Victoria approximately 20 feet behind the Ford, angling the vehicle slightly to provide some protection for the officers as they approached on foot. This was standard procedure, drilled into both men during their academy training and reinforced through years of traffic stops. What the procedure manuals had never adequately addressed was the possibility of a predator attack during a routine traffic stop. Bear 247 had followed the pursuit at a distance, his powerful legs carrying him through the forest at a steady lope that covered ground far more efficiently than the vehicles traveling the winding highway. Grizzly bears are capable of reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, and 247's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed him to take shortcuts through the woods that kept him parallel to the road chase. By the time the two vehicles came to a stop, the bear was positioned in a small clearing approximately 75 yards from the highway, hidden behind a screen of serviceberry bushes and young aspens. The bear's behavior during the next several minutes would later be analyzed by wildlife experts as a textbook example of a predatory stalk. Unlike defensive encounters, where bears typically make themselves known through vocalizations and threat displays, 247 remained completely silent as he slowly moved closer to the road. His massive head stayed low, and he used every available piece of cover to conceal his approach. Dr. Sarah Chen, a bear behavior specialist from the University of Montana, who would later review security footage from a nearby traffic camera, noted that 247's movements showed clear predatory intent and suggested that the bear had identified the humans as potential prey rather than territorial threats. Robert stepped out of the patrol car at exactly 9:24 a.m., his hand automatically checking the position of his service weapon, a Glock 22 chambered in .40 Smith & Wesson, while his eyes surveyed the scene for potential hazards. The morning air carried the scent of pine resin and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance a red-winged blackbird trilled its territorial call. Everything appeared routine, just another traffic stop in a career that had included thousands of similar encounters. Chris exited the passenger side a moment later, his own hand unconsciously mimicking Robert's weapon check. At 31, Chris was still young enough to feel a small thrill of adrenaline during pursuits and traffic stops, though he'd learned to channel that energy into heightened awareness rather than reckless aggression. His wife, Jennifer, often teased him about his cop swagger, the subtle change in posture and movement that came over him when he was in uniform. She didn't understand that the swagger was actually a survival mechanism, a way of projecting authority and confidence that could diffuse potentially dangerous situations. The two officers approached the Ford using standard protocol, with Robert taking the primary contact position at the driver's window, while Chris positioned himself slightly behind and to the right, where he could observe both the driver and any passengers while maintaining a clear line of sight to Robert. The truck's windows were tinted, making it difficult to see inside, and both officers noted this detail with the automatic threat assessment that had become second nature. Marcus Kellerman rolled down his window as the officers approached, and the smell of stale cigarettes and construction dust immediately filled the air. He was a large man, probably 250 pounds, with calloused hands and the sun-weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors for a living. His eyes were bloodshot, and both officers immediately noted the slight tremor in his hands as he fumbled for his wallet. "Good morning, sir," Robert said, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that had served him well throughout his career. "I'm Sheriff Lane, Flathead County. The reason I stopped you today is that I clocked you doing 73 in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. Can I see your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance?" Marcus's hands shook more noticeably as he rifled through his wallet. "I'm sorry, officer. I mean, Sheriff. I didn't realize how fast I was going. I've got a job site emergency, and I guess I wasn't paying attention to my speed." His voice carried the slight slur that both officers recognized as a sign of either fatigue or substance impairment. Chris stepped closer to the passenger side of the truck, his trained eyes scanning the interior for any signs of weapons or contraband. The truck's cab was cluttered with construction debris, empty energy drink cans, and what appeared to be prescription medication bottles. On the passenger seat lay a smartphone with a cracked screen, still displaying what looked like text messages. It was at this moment, 9:26 a.m., according to the timestamp on the patrol car's dashboard camera, that Bear 247 made his final approach. The massive grizzly had worked his way to within 40 feet of the roadway, using a fallen log and a cluster of bear grass to conceal his massive frame. His dark eyes, each the size of a silver dollar, remained fixed on the three humans who were completely unaware of his presence. Dr. Chen's later analysis of the bear's positioning would reveal the sophisticated hunting intelligence that grizzly bears possess. 247 had positioned himself downwind of the humans, ensuring that his scent wouldn't reach them, while simultaneously choosing an approach angle that would allow him to attack from the officer's blind spot. The sound of the running creek below the embankment had also served to mask any small noises the bear might have made during his stalk. Robert was examining Marcus's driver's license when he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. His first thought was that it might be a deer or elk emerging from the forest, a common sight along this stretch of highway. But as he turned his head slightly to get a better look, his blood ran cold. What emerged from the tree line wasn't a deer, but rather the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen in 23 years of patrolling Montana's wilderness areas. Bear 247 rose to his hind legs approximately 30 feet from the vehicles, his massive frame towering nearly 8 feet in height. His thick, dark brown fur rippled with muscle, and his enormous head swiveled back and forth as he assessed the scene before him. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey simply stared at each other, the morning air thick with tension and the promise of violence. "Chris," Robert said quietly, his voice carefully controlled despite the surge of adrenaline that was already flooding his system. "Don't turn around quickly, but we have a very large grizzly bear behind us." Chris felt every muscle in his body tense at Robert's words. His training kicked in immediately, and he slowly moved his right hand toward his service weapon while keeping his eyes fixed on Marcus, who was still obliviously searching through his glove compartment for his vehicle registration. The irony wasn't lost on Chris that they had stopped Marcus for speeding, only to find themselves in a situation where speed might be the only thing that could save their lives. "How big?" Chris whispered, his lips barely moving. 800 pounds, easy, Robert replied, his own hand now resting on the grip of his Glock. "Maybe more." Bear behavior experts would later debate whether 247's next actions represented calculated predatory behavior or simply territorial aggression triggered by the presence of humans in what he considered his domain. What was undisputable was that the bear dropped back to all fours and began moving toward the officers with deliberate, measured steps that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. Marcus finally looked up from his glove compartment, vehicle registration in hand, and his eyes immediately widened as he took in the expressions on both officers' faces. "What's wrong?" he asked, starting to turn around in his seat. "Stay in your vehicle," Robert commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Do not get out of the truck." But it was too late. Marcus had already spotted the bear through his rearview mirror, and his reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Instead of following Robert's order to remain in the vehicle, Marcus threw open his door and bolted from the truck, running directly toward the forest on the opposite side of the highway. His panicked flight triggered an immediate response from Bear 247, who interpreted the running human as fleeing prey. The bear's charge began at 9:27 a.m. and was captured in horrifying detail by the patrol car's dashboard camera. 247's massive form accelerated from a walking pace to a full sprint in less than 3 seconds. His powerful legs propelling his 800-pound frame across the intervening distance with a speed that defied belief. Grizzly bears can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, and 247 was moving at close to his maximum velocity as he closed the gap between himself and the 3 humans. Robert drew his service weapon and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the reports echoing off the surrounding mountains like thunder. His first shot went wide, striking a tree trunk 20 feet to the bear's left. His second shot hit 247 in the shoulder, but the .40 caliber round failed to penetrate deeply enough to reach any vital organs, instead serving only to further enrage the already aggressive predator. The third shot missed entirely, as Robert was forced to dive to his left to avoid the bear's charge. Chris had drawn his own weapon and managed to fire twice before the bear was on him. His first shot struck 247 in the chest, but again the thick hide and dense muscle mass prevented the bullet from causing significant damage. His second shot never had a chance to be fired as the bear's massive paw swept across his torso with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact lifted Chris off his feet and sent him flying backwards into the side of the patrol car with enough force to dent the metal door. He slid down the side of the vehicle, leaving a streak of blood on the white paint, and crumpled to the asphalt. His service weapon skittered across the ground, coming to rest in a patch of gravel near the highway's center line. Bear 247 was on top of Chris before the young deputy could even attempt to regain his feet. The bear's massive jaws, capable of exerting over 1,200 pounds of pressure per square inch, clamped down on Chris's head and neck with devastating effect. The sound that followed, a wet, crushing noise that would haunt Robert's nightmares for years to come, was captured by the patrol car's audio recording equipment and would later serve as crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation. Chris Owen's death was instantaneous. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, would later determine that the bear's initial bite had severed Chris's spinal cord at the C2 vertebra while simultaneously crushing his skull. There was no suffering, no prolonged agony, just the sudden violent end of a young life dedicated to protecting others. Robert, meanwhile, had managed to put the patrol car between himself and the bear, but his position was precarious at best. The Crown Victoria provided some cover, but bears are capable of extraordinary feats of strength when motivated, and 247's motivation was now driven by both predatory instinct and the pain from the gunshot wound in his shoulder. The bear released Chris's lifeless body and turned his attention to Robert, his dark eyes reflecting a cold intelligence that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. The radio in Robert's patrol car crackled to life as dispatcher Angela Martinez attempted to check on their status. "Unit 7, what's your 20? We're getting reports of gunshots in your area." Her voice, usually so calm and professional, carried a note of concern that suggested she was already beginning to suspect that something had gone wrong. Robert keyed the radio with a shaking hand while keeping his eyes fixed on the bear. "Dispatch Unit 7, officer down. We need immediate medical assistance and fish, wildlife and parks at our location. We have a grizzly bear attack in progress." His voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, a testament to decades of training and experience. "Copy that, Unit 7. Medical and wildlife are en route. What's your exact location?" "Highway 2, mile marker 49, approximately 2 miles north of our last reported position." Robert could see the bear moving around the front of the patrol car, testing different angles of approach. The animal's movements were calculated and patient, suggesting that this was not the first time 247 had hunted human prey. Bear 247's behavior during the next several minutes would be studied extensively by wildlife biologists and law enforcement professionals. Rather than continuing his attack immediately, the bear began what experts would later describe as prey-guarding behavior. He positioned himself over Chris's body while keeping his eyes fixed on Robert, occasionally making short charges toward the patrol car before backing away. This behavior suggested that the bear viewed Chris as his kill and was now defending it from potential scavengers, including Robert. Marcus Kellerman, meanwhile, had made it approximately 50 yards into the forest on the opposite side of the highway before colliding with a fallen tree and knocking himself unconscious. His panicked flight had actually saved his life by removing him from the immediate area of the attack, though he would later be discovered by search and rescue teams with a severe concussion and multiple lacerations from his run through the dense underbrush. The sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the mountains at 9:32 a.m., just 5 minutes after the attack began. The first responding unit was Deputy Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year veteran who had been patrolling a section of Highway 93 when she heard Robert's emergency call. Sarah's response time was remarkably fast, considering the remote location, but even she was not prepared for the scene that greeted her as she rounded the curve in the highway. Deputy Mitchell later described the scene in her official report. "Upon arrival at the scene, I observed Sheriff Lane positioned behind Unit 7, the patrol car, with his service weapon drawn. A large grizzly bear was positioned approximately 10 feet from the patrol car, standing over what appeared to be a human body. The bear was actively displaying aggressive behavior, including vocalizations and threat posturing. I could see immediately that the situation was extremely dangerous and that immediate action was required. Sarah positioned her patrol car approximately 100 yards from the scene and immediately requested additional backup and wildlife management support. Her training had included basic protocols for wildlife encounters, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for a situation where a bear had actually killed an officer and was now actively defending the body as prey. The bear's reaction to the arrival of the second patrol car was immediate and violent. 247 charged towards Sarah's position with the same explosive speed he had displayed during his initial attack, covering the distance in a matter of seconds. Sarah drew her service weapon and fired 6 shots, emptying her magazine into the charging bear. Unlike Robert's hasty shots, Sarah's rounds were more accurately placed, striking the bear in the chest and abdomen. But even with multiple gunshot wounds, 247's momentum carried him past Sarah's patrol car and into the forest on the far side of the highway. Dr. Chen's analysis of the bear's behavior during this phase of the encounter would later reveal the remarkable resilience and determination that makes grizzly bears one of North America's most dangerous predators. Despite suffering multiple gunshot wounds from high-powered law enforcement weapons, Bear 247 was still capable of sustained aggressive behavior and high-speed movement. This resilience is due in part to the bear's massive size and fat reserves, which can absorb significant trauma without immediately incapacitating the animal. With the bear temporarily driven off, Sarah was able to approach Robert's position and assess the situation more completely. What she found would be seared into her memory for the rest of her career. Chris Owens lay motionless beside the patrol car, his body showing the devastating effects of the bear attack. His uniform was torn and blood-soaked, and the extent of his injuries was immediately apparent even to someone without medical training. "He's gone," Robert said simply, his voice hollow with shock and grief. "Chris is gone." Sarah keyed her radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, Deputy Mitchell on scene, confirming officer fatality. We need the coroner, crime scene investigation, and a fish, wildlife and parks team with tranquilizer capability. The bear is wounded, but still in the area." The emergency medical response that followed was swift and professional, though it came too late to save Chris Owens' life. Paramedic teams from both Kalispell Regional Medical Center and North Valley Hospital responded to the scene, along with a life flight helicopter crew that had been placed on standby when the initial reports of the bear attack came in. EMT supervisor Janet Morrison, who had been working emergency medical services in Flathead County for 18 years, later described the scene as the most traumatic wildlife-related incident she had encountered in her career. Robert was examined by paramedics and found to be physically uninjured, though he was clearly suffering from acute stress reaction. His hands trembled as he gave his initial statement to investigators, and his eyes remained fixed on Chris's body even as crime scene technicians began their preliminary work. The psychological impact of witnessing his partner's violent death would prove to be far more devastating than any physical injury could have been. The search for Bear 247 began immediately, with Fish, Wildlife and Parks dispatching a specialized team that included tracking dogs and tranquilizer equipment. Game Warden Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran who had dealt with dozens of problem bear incidents, led the search effort. The blood trail left by the wounded bear was easy to follow initially, leading investigators deeper into the dense forest that bordered the highway. What the search team discovered would add another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. Bear 247's trail led to a small clearing approximately 300 yards from the highway, where investigators found clear evidence of a daybed, a temporary resting spot that the bear had used while stalking the officers. The depression in the earth showed that the bear had been lying in wait for an extended period, possibly as long as 30 minutes before launching his attack. This wasn't a chance encounter, Warden Torres told investigators. This bear deliberately stalked these officers and planned his attack. That's behavior we almost never see in grizzlies, and it makes him extremely dangerous. The blood trail continued for another half-mile before disappearing at a small creek. Despite extensive searching with tracking dogs and thermal imaging equipment, Bear 247 was not located that day. The wounded bear had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Bob Marshall ecosystem, leaving behind only blood, paw prints, and the devastated lives of those who had survived his attack. News of the attack spread quickly through the tight-knit community of Flathead County. Chris Owens had been a popular figure in the sheriff's department, known for his sense of humor and his dedication to community policing. He had volunteered as a youth baseball coach in his spare time and had been planning to propose to his girlfriend, Jennifer Morrison, in the coming summer. The randomness and violence of his death sent shockwaves through a community that had thought itself familiar with the dangers of living in bear country. The investigation that followed would be one of the most complex wildlife-related criminal cases in Montana history. While no criminal charges could be filed against the bear itself, investigators needed to determine whether any human actions had contributed to the attack. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks launched a parallel investigation into whether proper protocols had been followed and whether the attack could have been prevented. Security footage from a traffic camera located approximately 1 mile from the attack site provided crucial evidence about the events leading up to the encounter. The footage showed Bear 247 moving parallel to the highway for several minutes before the officers arrived, suggesting that the bear had been in the area for an extended period rather than simply wandering across their path by chance. Dr. Sarah Chen, the University of Montana bear behavior specialist, was brought in to analyze the available evidence and provide expert testimony about the bear's actions. Her preliminary findings were disturbing. Based on the physical evidence and the behavioral patterns documented in this case, Bear 247 displayed sophisticated predatory behavior that suggests previous human contact. This was not a defensive attack by a surprised or cornered bear, but rather a calculated predatory assault by an animal that had learned to view humans as prey. The implications of Dr. Chen's analysis were staggering. If her assessment was correct, Bear 247 represented a new type of threat, a grizzly bear that had crossed the line from opportunistic scavenger to active human predator. Such bears were extremely rare, but represented one of the most dangerous wildlife situations possible. The bear would need to be located and destroyed before he could attack again. The community response to Chris's death was immediate and overwhelming. The Flathead County Sheriff's Department was inundated with offers of assistance from law enforcement agencies across Montana and the surrounding states. The Montana State Police assigned additional patrols to the area, while the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provided specialized tracking equipment and personnel. A memorial fund was established for Chris's family, and within 48 hours of his death, over $50,000 had been donated by community members who wanted to help in some way. Local businesses posted signs expressing their condolences, and flowers began appearing at the sheriff's department as people struggled to process the sudden loss of a young man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. Robert Lane's recovery would prove to be far more complicated than anyone initially realized. While he had suffered no physical injuries during the attack, the psychological trauma of watching his partner die in such a violent manner began to manifest within days of the incident. He experienced severe nightmares that left him afraid to sleep, and he found himself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. The sound of sirens, which had once been simply part of his work environment, now triggered panic attacks that left him gasping for breath. Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma psychologist who specialized in treating first responders, was brought in to work with Robert. Her initial assessment revealed all the classic symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by what psychologists call survivor guilt, the irrational but overwhelming feeling that he should have been able to prevent Chris's death. Robert is experiencing a textbook case of PTSD with complicated grief, Dr. Foster explained to Robert's wife Sarah during a family counseling session. The suddenness and violence of the attack, combined with his close personal relationship with Deputy Owens, has created a perfect storm of psychological trauma. Recovery is going to be a long process that will require extensive therapy and probably medication. Sarah Lane had been Robert's anchor throughout his law enforcement career, and she was determined to help him through this crisis. But the man who came home from work each night was not the same person she had married 32 years earlier. Robert jumped at unexpected sounds, avoided going outdoors whenever possible, and spent hours staring out their living room window as if expecting danger to emerge from the forest that bordered their property. The search for Bear 247 continued for weeks, with teams of trackers and wildlife specialists combing thousands of acres of wilderness. Trail cameras were placed throughout the region, and Fish, Wildlife and Parks issued a standing shoot-on-sight order for any bear matching 247's description. But the massive grizzly seemed to have vanished into the vast expanse of the Bob Marshall wilderness, leaving behind only the memory of his devastating attack. 3 weeks after Chris's death, Bear 247 struck again. The second attack occurred at a remote camping area approximately 25 miles south of the original incident. 2 college students from the University of Montana, Jessica Hamilton and David Rodriguez, had been camping in the area as part of a wildlife biology field study when 247 found their campsite. The attack happened in the pre-dawn hours, and both students were killed before they could even attempt to defend themselves. The pattern of the second attack was remarkably similar to the first. Bear 247 had stalked his victims for an extended period before launching his assault, and the evidence suggested that he had been watching the campsite for possibly several hours before attacking. The bear's predatory behavior had escalated, confirming Dr. Chen's assessment that 247 had become an active human predator. The discovery of the 2 additional victims sent the community into a state of near panic. Schools were closed as a precautionary measure, and many residents began carrying firearms whenever they left their homes. The Montana governor declared a state of emergency for Flathead County and authorized the deployment of National Guard units to assist in the search for the killer bear. Robert learned of the second attack while attending his weekly therapy session with Dr. Foster. The news hit him like a physical blow, bringing back all the memories of Chris's death with renewed intensity. "I could have stopped this," he told Dr. Foster, tears streaming down his face. "If I had been a better shot, if I had reacted faster, Chris would still be alive and those kids would still be alive." Dr. Foster worked patiently to help Robert understand that he was not responsible for the bear's actions or the subsequent attacks. But the guilt and self-blame that are common in trauma survivors were proving particularly difficult to overcome in Robert's case. His sleep became even more disrupted, and he began experiencing flashbacks so vivid that he sometimes lost awareness of his present surroundings entirely. The massive search effort finally paid off when a trail camera captured clear images of Bear 247 near a remote creek approximately 30 miles from the original attack site. The photographs showed the bear's distinctive scars and confirmed that he was still in the area despite the intensive search efforts. More importantly, the images showed that the bear appeared to be healthy and mobile, despite the gunshot wounds he had suffered during the first attack. A specialized hunting team, led by professional guide and wildlife control expert Marcus Thompson, was assembled to track and eliminate Bear 247. Thompson had over 20 years of experience dealing with problem bears and had been involved in the removal of several dangerous grizzlies throughout the Rocky Mountain region. His team included experienced trackers, medical personnel, and additional armed backup in case the operation went wrong. "This bear has learned that humans are easy prey," Thompson explained to the assembled team during their mission briefing. "He's not going to run when he sees us coming. He's going to fight, and he's going to be extremely dangerous. Our job is to locate him quickly and take him down before he has a chance to attack again." The final confrontation with Bear 247 occurred on a cold morning in early May, nearly 5 weeks after Chris Owens' death. Thompson's team had been tracking the bear for 3 days, following a trail of paw prints and scat through some of the most rugged terrain in the region. The bear had led them on a circuitous route through dense forest and steep ravines, almost as if he was aware that he was being hunted. The end came suddenly and violently. Bear 247 was discovered in a small clearing near a natural spring, and he charged the hunting team as soon as he detected their presence. Thompson and 2 other team members fired simultaneously with high-powered rifles, and the massive bear was finally brought down after suffering multiple fatal wounds. Even in death, Bear 247 was an imposing sight, his massive frame measuring over 8 feet from nose to tail and weighing an estimated 850 pounds. The necropsy performed on Bear 247's body revealed several significant findings that helped explain his unusual behavior. The bear's stomach contents included human hair and fabric, confirming that he had indeed been feeding on his human victims. More disturbingly, examination of his brain tissue revealed abnormalities consistent with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a condition that can result from repeated head injuries and that may have contributed to his aggressive behavior toward humans. Dr. Chen's final report on the incident concluded that Bear 247 represented an extremely rare case of a grizzly bear that had developed into a true human predator. "In my 30 years of studying bear behavior," she wrote, "I have never encountered a case quite like this one." Bear 247's behavior patterns were consistent with those of a serial predator that had learned to actively hunt humans as prey. This type of behavior is so unusual that it may represent a new category of human-bear conflict that we need to study further. The death of Bear 247 brought some measure of closure to the families of his victims, but the healing process was far from over. Chris Owens was buried with full honors in a ceremony attended by hundreds of law enforcement officers from across the region. His girlfriend Jennifer had chosen to speak at the service, and her words captured the sense of loss that pervaded the entire community. "Chris always said that being a police officer wasn't just a job, it was a calling," Jennifer said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He believed that he was put on this earth to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Even though he's gone, I know that his spirit lives on in every officer who puts on a badge and goes out to serve their community." Robert attended the funeral, but found himself unable to speak during the service. The sight of Chris's flag-draped casket was too much for him to bear, and Sarah had to help him leave the church before the ceremony was complete. His grief was compounded by the knowledge that he would never again be able to work as a law enforcement officer. The psychological trauma of the bear attack had effectively ended a career that had defined his identity for over 2 decades. The legal aftermath of the incident was complex and far-reaching. While no criminal charges were filed in connection with the bear attack itself, several civil lawsuits were initiated by the families of the victims. The Owens family filed a wrongful death claim against Flathead County, arguing that inadequate training and equipment had contributed to Chris's death. Similar suits were filed on behalf of the 2 college students who had been killed in the second attack. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks also faced intense scrutiny over their handling of bear management in the region. Critics argued that the department had failed to adequately monitor and control the bear population, allowing a dangerous predator to remain at large until he had claimed multiple victims. The department ultimately agreed to implement enhanced monitoring and response protocols for dealing with problem bears. Robert's recovery continued to be slow and difficult. More than 6 months after the attack, he was still unable to work and spent most of his days at home, struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Foster had prescribed a combination of antidepressant medication and intensive therapy, but progress was minimal. The hypervigilance and paranoia that are common symptoms of PTSD made it impossible for Robert to feel safe in his own home, let alone consider returning to law enforcement work. The hardest part, Robert told Dr. Foster during one of their sessions, is knowing that Chris trusted me to protect him. He was like a son to me, and I failed him when he needed me most. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the ways I could have saved his life. Sarah Lane struggled with her own form of trauma as she watched her husband deteriorate psychologically. The man she had married had been confident and decisive, someone who took charge of difficult situations and protected others from danger. The person he had become was fearful and withdrawn, jumping at shadows and unable to make even simple decisions without extensive deliberation. I feel like I lost my husband on that highway too, Sarah confided to her sister during one of their weekly phone calls. Robert's body came home, but his spirit stayed out there with Chris. I don't know if he'll ever be the same person again. The community of Kalispell gradually began to return to some semblance of normalcy as the immediate threat of Bear 247 was eliminated. Schools reopened, and people slowly began venturing back into the wilderness areas that had been closed during the massive search effort. But the psychological impact of the attacks would linger for years, changing the way residents thought about their relationship with the natural world that surrounded them. The Montana legislature passed new funding for enhanced bear management programs in response to the attacks, and several new positions were created within Fish, Wildlife and Parks to focus specifically on human-bear conflict resolution. Trail cameras were installed throughout the region, and a new early warning system was implemented to alert authorities to the presence of potentially dangerous wildlife near populated areas. Dr. Chen was awarded a research grant to study the factors that might contribute to predatory behavior in grizzly bears, with the goal of preventing future incidents like the Bear 247 attacks. Her preliminary research suggested that habitat loss, climate change, and increasing human development in traditional bear territory might be creating conditions that force bears to seek alternative food sources, including humans. 1 year after the attack, a memorial was erected at the site where Chris Owens had died. The simple granite monument bore Chris's name, badge number, and the inscription, "He gave his life in service to others." The memorial service was attended by hundreds of people, including law enforcement officers from across the state and federal wildlife officials who had participated in the search for Bear 247. Robert attended the memorial service, but found it difficult to remain at the site for very long. The sound of traffic on the nearby highway triggered flashbacks so severe that Sarah had to drive him home, before the ceremony was complete. His therapist had warned him that visiting the site might be traumatic, but Robert had felt compelled to honor his fallen partner's memory. "I owe it to Chris to be here," Robert had told Sarah on the drive to the memorial site. "He would have done the same for me." The investigation into the Bear 247 attacks was officially closed 18 months after the incidents, with investigators concluding that the attacks represented an extremely unusual case of predatory behavior that could not have been predicted or prevented. The final report noted that all involved personnel had followed established protocols and that no evidence of negligence or misconduct had been found. However, the report also included several recommendations for changes to wildlife management practices and law enforcement protocols. These included enhanced training for officers working in areas with high bear populations, improved communication between fish, wildlife and parks, and local law enforcement agencies, and the development of new early warning systems to detect and track potentially dangerous wildlife. Robert Lane officially retired from law enforcement 3 years after the attack, accepting a disability pension that would allow him and Sarah to maintain their standard of living. His final day at the Sheriff's Department was marked by a small ceremony attended by his colleagues and friends, though Robert found it difficult to speak about his career or his experiences. Sheriff Patricia Martinez, who had been elected to replace the retiring sheriff who had hired Robert decades earlier, presented Robert with a commendation for his years of service and his courage during the bear attack. "Robert Lane represents the best of what law enforcement should be," Sheriff Martinez said during the ceremony. "His dedication to protecting others, even in the face of unimaginable danger, is an inspiration to all of us who wear the badge." In her private moments, Sarah Lane often wondered what their life would have been like if Robert had called in sick that morning, or if they had been assigned to patrol a different section of highway. The randomness of the attack was perhaps the most difficult aspect to accept, the idea that their entire future had been changed by a series of coincidences that had placed them in the path of a predator. Dr. Foster continued to work with Robert on a weekly basis, helping him to process the trauma and develop coping strategies for managing his PTSD symptoms. Progress was slow but measurable, and Robert gradually began to show signs of improvement. He started taking short walks around their neighborhood, something he'd been unable to do for months after the attack. "Healing from this kind of trauma isn't a linear process," Dr. Foster explained to Sarah during one of their family counseling sessions. "There will be good days and bad days, steps forward and steps backward. The important thing is that Robert is beginning to engage with the world again, even if it's in small ways." 5 years after the attack, Robert and Sarah moved to a small house in Missoula, hoping that a change of scenery might help Robert continue his recovery. The new location was in a more urban area, with fewer reminders of the wilderness where the attack had occurred. Robert found that he felt safer in the city environment, though he still struggled with crowds and unexpected noises. Chris Owen's memory was preserved in several ways throughout Flathead County. The annual law enforcement memorial service always included a specific recognition of his sacrifice, and a scholarship fund was established in his name to help young people pursue careers in law enforcement. Jennifer Morrison, who eventually married and started a family, made sure that her children knew about the brave police officer who had given his life protecting others. The Bear 247 attacks became a case study that was taught at law enforcement academies and wildlife management programs throughout the country. The incident highlighted the unique challenges faced by officers working in areas where human development intersected with large predator habitat, and it led to changes in training protocols and equipment standards. Dr. Chen's research into predatory behavior in grizzly bears continued for several years after the attacks. ultimately contributing to a better understanding of the factors that can lead to dangerous human-wildlife conflicts. Her work helped develop new strategies for managing bear populations in areas with significant human activity, potentially preventing future tragedies. The wilderness area where Bear 247 had lived and hunted was eventually designated as a special management zone, with enhanced monitoring and restricted public access during certain seasons. The designation served as both a practical safety measure and a memorial to those who had lost their lives in the attacks. On quiet evenings at their home in Missoula, Robert and Sarah would sometimes talk about their life before the attack, remembering happier times when Robert's biggest worry had been whether he would have enough years of service to qualify for full retirement benefits. They avoided discussing the details of the attack itself, but the shadow of that April morning was always present in their conversations. "Do you ever think about what Chris would be doing now if he had lived?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset. Robert was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Every day," he said finally. He would probably be married to Jennifer by now, maybe have a couple of kids. He always talked about wanting to make sergeant someday, maybe even run for sheriff when he got older. He had so many plans, so much life ahead of him. The grief and regret in Robert's voice were still evident, even years after the attack. The survivor's guilt that had plagued him from the beginning had never fully resolved, despite extensive therapy and the passage of time. Dr. Foster had warned that this might be a lifelong struggle, something that Robert would need to manage rather than overcome completely. As the 10th anniversary of the attack approached, Robert found himself thinking more frequently about that April morning and the split-second decisions that had changed so many lives. He had testified in several civil lawsuits related to the incident, reliving the details of the attack over and over again for attorneys and insurance investigators. Each retelling was traumatic, but Robert felt obligated to ensure that Chris's story was told accurately and completely. The final legal resolution of the Bear 247 case came nearly 8 years after the attacks, when the last of the civil lawsuits was settled out of court. The financial settlements provided some measure of security for the families of the victims, but no amount of money could truly compensate for the lives that had been lost or the trauma that continued to affect the survivors. In the end, the story of Bear 247 and the tragic events of April 1st, 2025 served as a sobering reminder of the unpredictable dangers that exist at the intersection of human civilization and the natural world. The attack had been unprecedented in its violence and premeditation, representing a type of wildlife conflict that few experts had imagined possible. Robert Lane continued his recovery journey, supported by Sarah's unwavering love and the professional guidance of Dr. Foster. He never returned to law enforcement, but he eventually found purpose in speaking to other first responders about trauma recovery and the importance of mental health resources. His message was simple but powerful. Surviving a traumatic event was only the beginning of a much longer journey toward healing. The wilderness of Montana continued to be home to hundreds of grizzly bears, most of which lived their entire lives without any significant contact with humans. Bear 247 had been an aberration, a predator whose behavior was so unusual that it defied the normal patterns of human-wildlife interaction. But his legacy lived on, in the changed protocols and enhanced awareness that his attacks had made necessary. On quiet nights when the wind was still and the moonlight filtered through the trees around their Missoula home, Robert would sometimes hear sounds that reminded him of that terrible morning, a branch breaking in the forest, the distant howl of a coyote, the rumble of a truck engine on the highway. Each sound would trigger a brief moment of panic, a flood of adrenaline that transported him back to the moment when everything changed. But Robert had learned to manage these flashbacks, to ground himself in the present moment and remember that he was safe. Dr. Foster had taught him breathing techniques and mindfulness practices that helped him maintain his emotional equilibrium, even when the memories threatened to overwhelm him. "The trauma will always be part of your story," Dr. Foster had told him during one of their sessions, "but it doesn't have to be the end of your story. You survived something that would have destroyed many people, and that survival means something. It means you have more to contribute, more life to live." As Robert sat on his porch in the gathering twilight, watching the lights of Missoula twinkle in the distance, he thought about Chris Owens and the life his young partner would never have. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was accompanied now by something else. Gratitude for the time they had shared together, pride in Chris's dedication to serving others, and a determination to honor his memory by living as fully as possible despite the trauma. The story of Bear 247 and the tragic events of that April morning had become part of Montana folklore, a cautionary tale told around campfires and in hunting lodges throughout the state. But for Robert Lane and the other survivors, it was much more than a story. It was a defining moment that had changed the trajectory of their lives forever. In the years that followed, Robert would sometimes receive letters from young law enforcement officers who had heard about the attack and wanted to express their admiration for his courage and survival. These letters always moved him deeply, reminding him that his experience, however tragic, had meaning for others who faced similar dangers in their daily work. "Your story helped me understand the risks we face every day," one young deputy had written. "It made me realize how important it is to tell my family I love them before I leave for work each day, because we never know what's waiting for us out there." These letters gave Robert a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his retirement from law enforcement. He began to speak more frequently at law enforcement academies and training conferences, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned about trauma recovery. His message resonated with officers who understood the unique stresses and dangers of their profession. Sarah watched her husband's gradual transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. The man who had come home from that highway so broken and afraid was slowly finding his way back to a life of meaning and purpose. He would never be exactly the same person he had been before the attack, but he was becoming someone new, someone who had survived the unthinkable and found a way to use that survival to help others. As the seasons passed and the anniversary of the attack came and went each year, Robert's nightmares became less frequent and less intense. The hypervigilance that had once made it impossible for him to relax gradually gave way to a more manageable level of awareness. He learned to distinguish between real threats and the phantom dangers that his traumatized mind had created. The Bear 247 case file remained in the archives of the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, a thick folder of reports, photographs, and witness statements that documented one of the most unusual wildlife attacks in Montana history. Young deputies who were assigned to review cold cases would sometimes come across the file and read Robert's account of that terrible morning, gaining a new appreciation for the dangers that could lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. Dr. Chen's research into predatory behavior in grizzly bears had yielded important insights into the factors that could lead to dangerous human-wildlife conflicts. Her work had contributed to new management strategies that were being implemented throughout bear habitat in North America, potentially preventing future tragedies like the Bear 247 attacks. The memorial to Chris Owens at the attack site had become a place of pilgrimage for law enforcement officers from throughout the region. Many would stop during their patrols to pay their respects to a fellow officer who had made the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty. Fresh flowers appeared at the memorial regularly, placed there by people who had never known Chris personally, but who understood the significance of his sacrifice. Jennifer Morrison had eventually remarried and started a family, but she made sure that her children learned about the brave police officer who had loved their mother and died protecting others. Chris's memory lived on through her stories and through the scholarship fund that continued to help young people pursue careers in law enforcement. As Robert entered his 70th year, he found himself reflecting more frequently on the lessons he had learned from his encounter with Bear 247. The attack had taught him about the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing each day. It had also shown him the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the power of love and support to help heal even the deepest wounds. "I wouldn't wish what happened to us on anyone," Robert told a group of rookie deputies during one of his training presentations. "But I've learned that we can survive things we never imagined possible, and that survival itself can be a form of service. Every day I wake up is another day I can honor Chris's memory and maybe help someone else who's facing their own dark valley." The wilderness of northwestern Montana remained largely unchanged, its vast forests and towering peaks indifferent to the human dramas that had played out within its borders. Bears continued to roam the backcountry, following the ancient rhythms of their species, while humans continued to venture into their domain in search of recreation, livelihood, and connection with the natural world. The balance between these two worlds, human civilization and wild nature, would always be delicate and sometimes dangerous. The story of Bear 247 served as a reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty and majesty, remained fundamentally wild and unpredictable. Those who chose to work and live at the intersection of these worlds did so with the understanding that danger was an ever-present reality. But the story was also a testament to the courage and dedication of people like Robert Lane and Chris Owens, who had chosen to put themselves at risk in order to protect others. Their willingness to face danger in service of their community represented the best of human nature, even in the face of nature's most fearsome predators. As the sun set over the mountains west of Missoula on another quiet evening, Robert Lane sat on his porch and remembered his fallen partner. The pain of that loss would never fully fade, but it had been tempered by time and transformed into something more bearable, a bittersweet mixture of grief and gratitude that honored both the dead and the living. The story of Bear 247 had become part of the larger narrative of human-wildlife conflict in the American West, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable consequences of sharing space with large predators. But for Robert, it would always be much more personal than that. It was the story of a young man's courage and sacrifice, and of the enduring bonds that tie people together, even in the face of unimaginable loss. In the years to come, as new generations of law enforcement officers took up the badge and began their own journeys of service, they would learn about Chris Owens and the morning when everything changed on a lonely stretch of Highway 2. His story would serve as both inspiration and warning, reminding them of the nobility of their calling and the very real dangers they faced in pursuing it. And in a small house in Missoula, Robert Lane would continue his own journey of healing and service, carrying with him the memory of a brave young deputy and the lessons learned from an encounter with one of nature's most fearsome predators. The bear was gone, but the story lived on, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit in the face of the wild. The next stories. #Blood on the Kodiak. The morning of October 21st, 2024, began with the kind of crystalline clarity that only Alaska's autumn could deliver. Jacob Turner stood on the deck of the Sarah's Dream, a weathered 32-foot fishing vessel that had been in his family for 3 generations, watching the sun paint the waters of Shelikof Strait in shades of copper and gold. At 43, Jacob possessed the weathered hands and wind-carved features of a man who had spent more than half his life wrestling fish from these unforgiving waters. His younger brother Samuel, 38, and still carrying the restless energy of someone who believed the sea owed him something, emerged from the cabin with 2 steaming cups of coffee and the confident grin that had gotten him into more trouble than Jacob cared to count. "Look at that water, Jake," Samuel said, handing over one of the cups. "Smooth as glass. The salmon are going to be jumping right into our nets today." Samuel Turner had always been the optimist of the family, the one who saw potential windfalls where Jacob saw potential disasters. Where Jacob calculated fuel costs and weather patterns, Samuel dreamed of record catches and early retirements. It was a dynamic that had served them well over the 15 years they'd been fishing together, Jacob's caution balancing Samuel's ambition. But on this particular morning, standing in the deceptive calm of Larsen Bay, that balance would prove insufficient against the ancient forces that ruled this wilderness. The Turner brothers had been born into the fishing life in the small community of Kodiak, Alaska, population 6,130, on a good day when the fishing fleet was in port. Their father, Marcus Turner, had died when Jacob was 25 and Samuel 20, leaving them the boat, the fishing permits, and a mortgage that had taken them 8 years to pay off. Their mother, Sarah Turner, for whom the boat was named, had remarried and moved to Anchorage, visiting only during the summer months when the weather made travel bearable and the fishing was good enough to justify the expense of her visits. The brothers had built their lives around the rhythm of the seasons, following the salmon runs from spring through fall, crabbing in the winter when the weather allowed, and spending the darkest months maintaining their equipment and planning for the next year. This October trip was meant to be their last major fishing expedition before winter set in. They had been targeting the late-season coho salmon run in the protected waters near Larsen Bay, approximately 47 miles southwest of Kodiak City. The bay offered excellent fishing opportunities, while providing shelter from the increasingly violent storms that marked the transition from autumn to winter. They had been working these waters for 6 days, averaging about 800 pounds of salmon per day, enough to make the trip profitable but not so much as to make them wealthy. Their routine had been simple and effective. Anchor in the bay before dawn, set their nets in a wide semicircle and work the lines until late afternoon before returning to their temporary anchorage for the night. On the morning of October 21st, they had been anchored approximately 2 miles from shore in 68 feet of water, their position marked by GPS coordinates that Jacob meticulously recorded in the ship's log: 57 degrees, 12 minutes, 34 seconds north, 154 degrees, 18 minutes, 45 seconds west. The water temperature was 42 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a man in less than 30 minutes if he went overboard without protection, but not unusual for the season. The air temperature was 38 degrees, with a light northwest wind at 6 knots and unlimited visibility under clear skies. According to the National Weather Service forecast, conditions were expected to remain stable throughout the day, with only a slight chance of afternoon showers. Samuel had been the first to notice the bears on shore. "Jesus, Jake, look at the size of those things," he had said, pointing toward the rocky beach approximately half a mile distant. Through binoculars, Jacob could see 3 brown bears, massive even at this distance, moving slowly along the shoreline. Kodiak bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, were a common sight in these waters, particularly during salmon runs, when the fish provided an easy source of high-calorie food necessary for the bears to build fat reserves for winter hibernation. Adult males could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, making them among the largest land carnivores on Earth. "They're fishing, same as us," Jacob had replied, lowering his binoculars. "Just stay downwind and give them plenty of space." This was standard protocol for anyone working in bear country. Kodiak Island supported an estimated 3,500 brown bears, one of the densest populations of large carnivores anywhere in the world. Most encounters between humans and bears were brief and uneventful, with the bears typically showing little interest in humans unless threatened or surprised. Jacob had seen hundreds of bears during his years fishing these waters and had never had a serious confrontation. The morning's fishing had been unusually productive. By 11 o'clock they had hauled in nearly 600 pounds of salmon, mostly cohos ranging from 8 to 12 pounds, with a few larger kings mixed in. The fish were bright and fresh, having just entered the bay from the open ocean, and would command premium prices at the processing plant in Kodiak. Samuel worked the hydraulic puller that brought in the nets, while Jacob sorted the catch, keeping the high-quality salmon and releasing the few lingcod and rockfish that had been caught as bycatch. "This is the kind of day Dad used to dream about," Samuel said during a brief break in the action. "Remember how he used to say that one perfect day could make up for a whole week of bad ones?" Marcus Turner had been a philosopher as well as a fisherman, prone to lengthy speeches about the relationship between man and nature, the importance of respecting the sea, and the dangers of taking anything for granted. He had died of a heart attack while hauling nets on a calm October morning much like this one, collapsing on the deck of the Sarah's Dream and dying before Jacob could get him to shore. The memory had haunted both brothers, particularly during the fall fishing season when the conditions most closely resembled that terrible day. By noon, they had moved their operation closer to shore, attracted by the sight of salmon jumping in the shallower water near the mouth of a small creek that emptied into the bay. This was prime fishing territory, but it also brought them within 300 yards of the beach where the bears had been active. Jacob had expressed concerns about the proximity, but Samuel had argued that the potential catch justified the risk. "We're still plenty far offshore," he had said. "Bears don't swim that far out, and even if they did, what are they going to do to a 32-foot boat?" The question would be answered sooner than either brother anticipated. At approximately 12:45 p.m., while Jacob was in the cabin updating the ship's log and checking weather reports on the marine radio, Samuel spotted something in the water approximately 100 yards off their starboard bow. At first, he thought it might be a seal or sea lion, both common in these waters, but as the object moved closer, he realized with growing alarm that it was much larger than any marine mammal had a right to be. "Jake!" Samuel called, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that immediately got his brother's attention. "You need to see this." Jacob emerged from the cabin to find Samuel pointing at what appeared to be a large, dark object moving through the water with surprising speed and purpose. As it drew closer, the shape resolved into something that defied their understanding of normal bear behavior. A massive brown bear swimming directly toward their boat with powerful rhythmic strokes that suggested both strength and determination. "That's not possible," Jacob said, reaching for his binoculars. Through the lenses he could see the bear's massive head cutting through the water, its small ears laid back against its skull, its dark eyes fixed on their vessel. The animal was swimming with the confident stroke of a creature completely at home in the water, covering the distance between shore and boat with alarming efficiency. Bears don't swim this far from shore. They just don't do that. But even as Jacob spoke, both brothers understood that whatever rules they thought governed bear behavior were about to be rewritten. The animal in the water was easily the largest bear either man had ever seen, with a head the size of a beer keg and massive shoulders that rolled beneath its thick fur with each stroke. Conservative estimates based on its visible size suggested the animal weighed well over 1,000 pounds, possibly closer to 1,200 or 1,300 pounds, making it a truly exceptional specimen even by Kodiak standards. "Start the engine," Jacob ordered, his voice taking on the flat, controlled tone he used during emergencies. "We're getting out of here." Samuel moved toward the engine controls, but his movements were hampered by a combination of disbelief and morbid fascination. The bear was now less than 50 yards away and showing no signs of changing course or tiring. Its swimming style was remarkably efficient, using its massive forepaws to pull itself through the water while its powerful hind legs provided propulsion. The animal's head remained above water at all times, its eyes never leaving the boat. The Sarah's Dream was equipped with a 350 horsepower diesel engine that could push the fully loaded vessel to a top speed of approximately 18 knots, more than enough to outrun a swimming bear under normal circumstances. But as Samuel engaged the starter, the engine turned over several times without catching. The brothers had been having intermittent problems with the fuel system for the past month, issues that their mechanic in Kodiak had assured them were minor and could be addressed after the fishing season. Those assurances now seemed tragically inadequate as the engine continued to refuse to start. Come on," Samuel muttered, working the starter again and again, while Jacob moved to the stern to assess their situation. The bear was now 30 yards away and had shown no signs of slowing down. If anything, the animal seemed to be increasing its pace, as if sensing the urgency in the brothers' movements. Jacob had never seen anything like it in 25 years of fishing these waters. Bears were excellent swimmers, capable of covering several miles in open water when necessary, but they typically stayed close to shore and showed little interest in boats or other human activity. This bear was different. There was something in its approach that suggested not just curiosity, but active intent, as if the animal had made a conscious decision to investigate or confront their vessel. Its eyes, visible even at this distance, seemed to track their movements with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. Jacob had read accounts of rogue bears that had lost their fear of humans, animals that had learned to associate human activity with food, and had become increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of easy meals. Such bears were rare, but extremely dangerous, requiring intervention by wildlife authorities and often resulting in the animal's destruction. "The engine's not starting," Samuel reported, his voice beginning to show the first signs of panic. "The fuel pump's not priming properly." This was a problem that had plagued them intermittently throughout the trip, usually resolving itself after several attempts and some creative manipulation of the fuel system. Under normal circumstances, it was an annoying but manageable issue. With a massive predator approaching their vessel, it had become potentially catastrophic. Jacob made a quick mental inventory of their options. They carried an emergency radio beacon that could summon Coast Guard assistance, but help was at least an hour away, even under the best circumstances. They had life jackets and a small inflatable raft that could support both men in an emergency, but launching it would require several minutes of preparation and would leave them completely vulnerable to the approaching bear. Their only weapons were a .3006 rifle that Jacob kept for protection against bears while on shore, and a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with buckshot. Both weapons were secured in a locked cabinet below deck, and retrieving them would require precious time they might not have. "Keep trying the engine," Jacob ordered, moving toward the cabin. "I'm getting the rifle." But as he reached for the cabin door, the bear reached their boat. The animal's massive head appeared at the waterline near the stern, its dark eyes studying the vessel with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For a moment, bear and men simply stared at each other across the few feet of space that separated predator from prey, each side taking the measure of the other. The bear was even larger than it had appeared in the water. Its head was massive, easily 18 inches from nose to ears, with a broad skull that spoke of tremendous bite force. Its fur was a rich chocolate brown, with lighter highlights around the face and ears, suggesting an animal in its prime. The bear's nose, black and wet, worked constantly as it processed the complex array of scents coming from the boat: fish, fuel, food, and the increasingly sharp smell of human fear. What happened next would be debated by wildlife experts for months afterward. Instead of losing interest and swimming away, as both logic and experience suggested it should, the bear began to investigate the boat more actively. It swam slowly around the stern, its massive paws occasionally making contact with the hull as it tested the structure. The Sarah's Dream, while sturdy, had not been designed to withstand contact with a 1,200-pound predator, and each touch sent vibrations through the deck that the brothers could feel in their bones. "It's trying to climb aboard," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear had positioned itself at the stern and was attempting to pull itself up onto the low transom where the brothers typically hauled their nets. The animal's front paws, each equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, scraped against the fiberglass hull as it sought purchase. The boat, designed for stability while fishing, began to list noticeably to stern as the bear's weight shifted its center of gravity. Jacob reached the weapon cabinet and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking with a combination of adrenaline and disbelief. This was beyond anything in his experience or training. Bears occasionally approached fishing boats drawn by the smell of fish, but they typically maintained a respectful distance and departed when they realized the fish were out of reach. This animal showed no such restraint. It seemed determined to board their vessel, and its size and strength made such an outcome not just possible, but likely. The 30-006 rifle was a Remington Model 700 that Jacob had owned for 15 years, equipped with a 4-time scope and loaded with 180-grain bullets designed for large game. It was an accurate and powerful weapon, capable of stopping any animal in North America if placed properly, but shooting a bear from a rocking boat while the animal was partially in the water presented challenges that even an experienced marksman would find daunting. A wounded bear would become exponentially more dangerous, and a poorly placed shot might only serve to enrage an already aggressive animal. As Jacob emerged from the cabin with the rifle, the bear succeeded in getting its front paws over the transom. The animal's massive shoulders appeared above the waterline as it prepared to haul itself aboard, and for the first time the brothers could see the full extent of the predator that had invaded their world. The bear's chest was easily 4 feet across, covered in thick fur that was still dripping seawater. Its front legs, as thick as telephone poles, ended in paws the size of dinner plates, each armed with claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. "Shoot it!" Samuel screamed, abandoning his efforts to start the engine and grabbing a gaff hook from the deck. The gaff was a 6-foot pole with a sharp metal hook designed for handling large fish, hardly adequate for defending against a predator of this size, but the only weapon immediately available. Samuel moved toward the stern, the gaff raised like a spear, his face white with terror, but his body moving with the automatic responses of a man who had spent his life dealing with dangerous situations. Jacob raised the rifle, trying to find a stable shooting position on the rocking deck. The bear was now half out of the water, its weight causing the stern to sink dangerously low. Water was beginning to slosh over the transom, and Jacob realized that even if he could drive the bear off, they might already be taking on too much water to remain afloat. The animal's eyes, small and dark, found his and held them with an intensity that seemed to bore directly into his soul. In that moment, Jacob understood that he was not dealing with a normal bear motivated by hunger or curiosity. This was something else, something driven by an aggression that bordered on rage. The shot, when it came, was hasty and poorly aimed. Jacob's bullet caught the bear in the left shoulder, a hit that would have dropped most animals but seemed only to annoy this massive predator. The bear's head swung toward Jacob with frightening speed, its lips pulling back to reveal canine teeth the size of a man's thumb. The animal's roar, deep and primal, seemed to come from some prehistoric past when such creatures ruled the earth without challenge. It was a sound that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of the human brain, triggering responses that had kept the species alive during the long millennia when humans were prey rather than predators. The wounded bear completed its climb onto the boat with startling agility for such a massive creature. Once aboard, it stood to its full height, easily 8 feet tall and weighing more than both brothers combined. The deck groaned under its weight, and several of the aluminum railings bent or broke as the animal moved forward with deliberate predatory intent. Its wounded shoulder bled freely, staining its fur and the deck, but the injury seemed to have had no effect on its mobility or determination. Samuel met the bear's advance with the gaff hook, striking at the animal's massive head with desperate courage. The metal point drew blood from the bear's muzzle, but the weapon was wholly inadequate against such a massive opponent. The bear's response was swift and devastating. One massive paw, moving faster than seemed possible for something so large, struck Samuel across the chest and sent him flying across the deck. He hit the port railing with a sickening sound of breaking ribs and collapsed in a heap, the gaff hook spinning away into the water. Jacob worked the bolt of his rifle, chambering another round while backing toward the bow. The bear turned its attention to him, moving forward with the rolling gait of an animal completely confident in its superiority. Its small eyes never left his face, and Jacob could see an intelligence there that was utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. This was not the mindless aggression of a rabid animal or the defensive reaction of a surprised predator. This was calculated, purposeful violence from a creature that had decided these humans represented either a threat to be eliminated or prey to be consumed. The second shot took the bear in the chest, striking somewhere near the heart. Any normal animal would have been mortally wounded, but this bear seemed to absorb the bullet's impact without apparent effect. It continued its advance, now less than 10 feet from Jacob, close enough that he could smell its breath, a mixture of rotting salmon and something else, something wild and predatory that made his stomach clench with primal fear. Samuel was attempting to rise, one hand pressed against his side where his ribs had been broken by the bear's blow. Blood ran from his mouth, suggesting internal injuries that would require immediate medical attention if he was to survive. But medical attention seemed increasingly unlikely as the bear continued its methodical destruction of everything in its path. The animal had turned the Sarah's dream from a safe workspace into a floating slaughterhouse, and both brothers understood that their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing second. The third shot was fired from point-blank range as the bear reared up on its hind legs directly in front of Jacob. The bullet entered the animal's throat and should have been instantly fatal, but the bear's momentum carried it forward, its massive paws striking Jacob in the chest with the force of sledgehammers. Jacob felt his ribs crack under the impact and found himself on his back, the rifle spinning away across the deck. The bear, blood now pouring from multiple wounds, stood over him with its massive paws on either side of his body. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey stared at each other. The bear's breathing was labored, and Jacob could see that his shots had been effective, even if not immediately fatal. Blood dripped from the animal's mouth onto his face, warm and sticky, carrying the metallic taste of approaching death. But whose death remained to be seen. The bear's eyes, clouding with pain and blood loss, still held that terrible intelligence, as if the animal was making a conscious decision about how to end this encounter. The bear's decision was to bite. Its massive head descended toward Jacob's face with deliberate precision, jaws opening to reveal teeth that could crush a human skull like an eggshell. Jacob managed to get his left arm up in a futile attempt at protection, and the bear's jaws closed around his forearm with the force of a hydraulic press. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, beyond anything he had ever experienced. He could feel the bones in his arms snap like twigs, could hear the sound of his own screams mixing with the bear's labored breathing. Samuel, fighting through his own injuries, had retrieved the shotgun from its cabinet and was attempting to load it with hands that shook from pain and shock. The 12-gauge was loaded with slugs rather than buckshot, 1-ounce projectiles that could penetrate engine blocks, and had been chosen specifically for their effectiveness against large, dangerous game. But loading the weapon required fine motor control that Samuel no longer possessed. His hands made clumsy by pain and the early stages of shock. The bear, still holding Jacob's arm in its jaws, began to shake its head like a dog with a rope toy. The motion sent fresh waves of agony through Jacob's body as his arm was twisted and torn by forces that human anatomy was never designed to withstand. He could feel his shoulder dislocating, could hear the wet sounds of tissue tearing as the bear's teeth found purchase in muscle and bone. Blood loss was beginning to make him lightheaded, and he understood with clinical clarity that he was bleeding to death on the deck of his family's boat. Samuel finally managed to load the shotgun and raised it with trembling hands. The bear was directly above Jacob, making a clean shot impossible without risking his brother's life. But as Jacob's screams grew weaker and the pool of blood beneath him continued to expand, Samuel realized that hesitation might mean losing them both. He aimed for the bear's head, hoping that the slug's massive stopping power would end the encounter before Jacob bled out. The shotgun slug struck the bear behind the left ear, penetrating the skull and destroying a significant portion of the animal's brain. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear's jaws opened, releasing Jacob's mangled arm, and the massive body collapsed onto the deck with a sound like a falling tree. Blood and brain matter spattered across the deck, mixing with the seawater that continued to pour through the damaged stern. But the bear's death, while ending the immediate threat, had not solved their underlying problems. The Sarah's Dream was taking on water at an alarming rate, her stern riding so low that waves were washing over the transom with each swell. The boat's pumps, designed to handle normal levels of water intrusion, were unable to cope with the massive influx through the damaged hull. Within minutes, the vessel would sink, taking both brothers down with her, unless immediate action was taken. Jacob was unconscious, his face grey from blood loss, his mangled arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Samuel, fighting through his own injuries, dragged his brother toward the emergency life raft, a 4-person inflatable that was their only hope of survival in the frigid waters of Shelikof Strait. Deploying the raft required pulling a lanyard that would trigger an automatic inflation system, but Samuel's injured ribs made every movement agony, and his hands were slick with blood from both his own wounds and his brother's. The raft inflated successfully, but getting Jacob's unconscious body from the sinking deck into the unstable platform required strength that Samuel no longer possessed. Each attempt to lift his brother sent fresh waves of pain through his damaged ribs, and he could feel his own strength ebbing as shock began to set in. The water around the boat was now stained red with blood from both the bear and the brothers, creating a scene that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who might witness it. Time was running out. The Sarah's Dream was settling by the stern, her bow rising at an increasingly steep angle as water flooded the engine compartment and fish hold. Samuel managed to activate the emergency beacon, sending out a distress signal that would summon help from the Coast Guard station in Kodiak. But help was at least 40 minutes away, even if a helicopter was immediately available. In the 42-degree water, survival time for an unprotected human was measured in minutes, not hours. With a desperate surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Samuel managed to roll Jacob into the life raft, then climbed in himself as the Sarah's Dream began her final plunge toward the bottom of Larsen Bay. The boat that had supported the Turner family for 3 generations disappeared beneath the surface with surprising speed, taking with her the massive bear carcass, their fishing equipment, and the emergency supplies that might have made the difference between survival and death. The life raft, designed for survival rather than comfort, provided minimal protection against the October cold. Both brothers were soaked from their time on the sinking deck, and the combination of wet clothing and air temperatures just above freezing created conditions ideal for hypothermia. Jacob remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his pulse weak and thready from blood loss. Samuel used the raft's emergency medical kit to fashion a tourniquet for his brother's mangled arm, but the supplies were minimal, and his own injuries made precise work nearly impossible. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Samuel used the raft's emergency mirror to signal passing aircraft, but the skies remained empty except for the occasional gull. The emergency beacon continued to broadcast their position, but whether anyone was receiving the signal remained unknown. Jacob's condition continued to deteriorate, his skin taking on the waxy pallor of severe blood loss, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as shock set in. Samuel found himself fighting his own battle against the cold and his injuries. His broken ribs made breathing painful, and he suspected internal bleeding based on the taste of blood in his mouth and the growing pain in his abdomen. The combination of cold, injury, and psychological trauma was beginning to affect his thinking, making it difficult to focus on the survival tasks that might keep them alive until help arrived. At approximately 2:30 p.m., nearly 2 hours after the bear attack began, the distinctive sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of a Coast Guard helicopter from Air Station Kodiak. The MH-60 Jayhawk, crewed by 4 highly trained rescue specialists, had been dispatched immediately upon receiving the emergency beacon signal, but the distance from base to the rescue site had required more than an hour of flight time. From the air, the crew could see the orange life raft bobbing in the swells, 2 figures huddled inside, and an expanding slick of oil and debris that marked the location where the Sarah's Dream had gone down. The rescue operation that followed was textbook Coast Guard efficiency. Rescue swimmer aviation survival technician 2nd Class Maria Rodriguez was lowered to the raft by hoist, her first priority being to assess the medical condition of both survivors and provide emergency treatment. What she found exceeded even her considerable experience with marine emergencies. Jacob Turner was barely alive, having lost massive amounts of blood from wounds that spoke of a violence almost beyond comprehension. Samuel Turner was conscious, but showing signs of significant internal injuries, and was entering the early stages of hypothermia. "We've got 2 critical patients," Rodriguez reported to the helicopter crew. "One with massive trauma to the left arm, possible amputation, severe blood loss, and shock. Second patient has multiple rib fractures and possible internal bleeding, both showing signs of hypothermia. We need immediate transport to trauma facilities." The helicopter crew, led by Aircraft Commander Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, immediately began coordinating with medical facilities in Kodiak and Anchorage to ensure that appropriate surgical teams would be standing by. Jacob Turner was hoisted aboard first, his unconscious form secured to a Stokes litter that would keep him stable during the flight. Samuel, despite his own injuries, insisted on providing what details he could about the attack to help medical personnel understand what they were dealing with. His account of a massive bear swimming out to attack their boat seemed almost too incredible to believe, but the evidence of massive trauma was undeniable, and the Coast Guard crew had seen enough wilderness emergencies to know that Alaska's wildlife was capable of violence that defied easy explanation. The flight to Kodiak took 22 minutes, during which aviation electronics technician First Class Robert Chen provided continuous medical monitoring, while Rodriguez worked to stabilize both patients. Jacob's blood pressure was critically low despite the efforts to control bleeding, and his pulse was becoming increasingly irregular. Samuel remained conscious, but was showing signs of significant internal bleeding, his blood pressure dropping and his skin taking on the greyish pallor that indicated shock. Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center had been alerted to expect critical trauma patients and had assembled their most experienced surgical team under the direction of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a surgeon who had spent 15 years treating the hunting and fishing accidents that were an unfortunate reality of life in Alaska. But even her considerable experience with bear attacks had not prepared her for the extent of Jacob Turner's injuries. The bear's jaws had not only broken both bones in his forearm, but had also severed major blood vessels and damaged nerves and tendons to an extent that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. Samuel Turner's injuries, while less visually dramatic, were potentially just as serious. X-rays revealed 4 broken ribs and a pneumothorax that required immediate attention. More concerning was evidence of internal bleeding that suggested damage to the spleen or liver, injuries that would require surgical exploration to properly assess and treat. Both brothers were taken directly to surgery, beginning medical odysseys that would last for months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The attack also triggered an immediate investigation by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, led by wildlife biologist Dr. Mark Stevens, who had spent more than 20 years studying Kodiak bears and had never encountered a case quite like this one. Bears attacking boats was virtually unknown in the scientific literature, and the aggressive, purposeful nature of the attack as described by Samuel Turner suggested either an abnormal animal or circumstances that had triggered unusual behavior. A search and recovery mission was launched the following day to locate the sunken Sarah's Dream and recover the bear carcass for scientific examination. The boat was found in 72 feet of water, her hull cracked and broken from the violent encounter and subsequent sinking. The bear's body was recovered by divers and transported to the Fish and Game Laboratory in Anchorage for a complete necropsy that might explain the animal's aberrant behavior. The examination revealed a male Kodiak bear in apparently perfect health, estimated to be between 8 and 10 years old and weighing approximately 1,280 pounds, making it one of the largest specimens ever documented. More puzzling was the complete absence of any disease, injury, or abnormality that might explain its aggressive behavior. The bear's stomach contents revealed a normal diet of salmon, berries, and other natural foods, with no evidence of human garbage or other attractants that might have created an abnormal association with people. Dr. Stevens's preliminary report, filed 2 weeks after the attack, concluded that the incident represented an extremely rare case of unprovoked aggression by a healthy adult bear, possibly triggered by territorial behavior during the pre-hibernation feeding period when bears become increasingly focused on securing high-calorie food sources. However, the report acknowledged that the swimming attack behavior was unlike anything in the scientific literature and might represent either a learned behavior or an individual abnormality that died with the animal. The story of the bear attack quickly spread beyond the fishing community, picked up first by local media in Anchorage and then by national news outlets fascinated by the seemingly impossible nature of the incident. The image of a massive bear swimming out to attack a fishing boat captured public imagination in a way that more typical bear encounters did not, and the Turner brothers found themselves the subject of intense media attention while they struggled to recover from their physical and psychological wounds. Jacob Turner's recovery was slow and complicated. His left arm, while saved from amputation, required 3 major surgeries to repair the damage done by the bear's jaws. Plates and screws held his fractured bones together, while surgeons attempted to reconstruct damaged blood vessels and reattach severed tendons. The nerve damage was extensive, leaving him with limited feeling and mobility in his hand that would likely never fully return. Physical therapy would continue for months, and even the most optimistic projections suggested he would never regain full use of the arm. Samuel Turner's recovery, while faster, was marked by complications that kept him hospitalized for 3 weeks. The internal bleeding had been more extensive than initially realized, requiring 2 surgeries to repair damage to his spleen and liver. His broken ribs healed slowly, and the psychological trauma of the attack manifested in nightmares and panic attacks that required professional counseling. Both brothers found themselves dealing with post-traumatic stress symptoms that were as debilitating as their physical injuries. The financial impact of the attack was devastating. The Sarah's dream, while insured, had been the brothers' primary source of income, and her loss during the peak of fishing season eliminated them to complete their most profitable trips of the year. The insurance settlement, while covering the boat's replacement value, could not compensate for lost income or the medical expenses that quickly mounted into 6 figures. Both brothers faced the possibility of losing their homes and being forced to abandon the fishing life that had sustained their family for generations. The broader fishing community rallied around the Turner brothers with a level of support that reflected both the tight-knit nature of Alaska's maritime community and the recognition that what had happened to the Turners could happen to anyone working these waters. A benefit fund was established to help with medical expenses and living costs while the brothers recovered, raising more than $150,000 through donations from fellow fishermen, local businesses, and strangers touched by their story. But money, while essential for practical survival, could not address the psychological wounds left by the encounter. Both brothers found themselves questioning whether they could ever return to the waters where they had spent their lives, whether the ocean that had sustained their family could ever again feel like anything other than a hostile environment inhabited by predators capable of unimaginable violence. The simple act of being on the water, which had once brought peace and purpose to their lives, now triggered anxiety attacks and flashbacks to those terrible minutes when a 1,000-pound predator had transformed their familiar workplace into a scene from a nightmare. Jacob, in particular, struggled with what doctors termed survivor's guilt, a sense that he had somehow failed to protect his brother and their livelihood from the attack. The fact that his wounds were more severe than Samuel's only intensified these feelings, creating a psychological burden that proved more difficult to treat than his physical injuries. He began drinking heavily during his recovery, self-medicating against both physical pain and psychological trauma in a way that threatened to destroy his marriage and alienate his children. Samuel, despite his own trauma, found himself taking on the role of family spokesperson, dealing with media requests and insurance investigators while trying to plan for an uncertain future. The attention was unwelcome but necessary, as their story had attracted offers of help from around the country, including potential employment opportunities that might allow them to remain in Alaska even if they could never return to fishing. But every interview, every retelling of the attack, forced him to relive those terrible moments when death had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The investigation into the attack continued for months, driven partly by scientific curiosity and partly by the practical need to understand whether similar incidents might be expected in the future. Dr. Stevens interviewed dozens of local residents and fishermen, trying to establish whether there had been any previous signs of unusual bear behavior in the area. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. While bears had been seen swimming in the bay before, none had shown any interest in boats or fishing operations. One theory that gained some credence involved the unusual abundance of salmon in Larsen Bay during the weeks leading up to the attack. Fish and Game surveys had documented salmon runs that were significantly above average, creating feeding opportunities that might have attracted bears from a wide area and led to increased competition for resources. It was possible that the attacking bear had been drawn to the area by the abundant fish and had learned to associate boats with easy meals, leading to increasingly bold behavior that culminated in the attack. But this theory, like all the others, remained speculative. The bear that had attacked the Turner brothers had taken its motivations to the bottom of Larsen Bay, leaving behind only questions and a level of violence that challenged basic assumptions about wildlife behavior. Dr. Stevens' final report, published 6 months after the attack, acknowledged that the incident remained an anomaly that defied easy explanation, but recommended increased caution for anyone fishing or boating in known bear habitat during the critical pre-hibernation feeding period. The legal aftermath of the attack proved almost as complex as the scientific investigation. While the attack itself was clearly an act of nature for which no human agency could be held responsible, questions arose about whether proper safety protocols had been followed and whether the brothers had taken adequate precautions while fishing in known bear habitat. The Coast Guard investigation, completed 3 months after the attack, found no evidence of negligence or safety violations and concluded that the incident represented an unforeseeable natural disaster rather than the result of human error. Insurance companies, however, proved less understanding. The policy on the Sarah's Dream contained exclusions for damage caused by wild animals, and the insurance company initially denied the claim on the grounds that the bear attack constituted a covered exclusion. It took 6 months of legal battles and media pressure before the company agreed to pay the claim, acknowledging that the exclusion was intended to cover damage caused by animals already aboard the vessel rather than attacks by wildlife from outside. Workers' compensation claims proved equally contentious. While both brothers had been injured in the course of their employment, the unique nature of the attack raised questions about whether bear attacks constituted a normal occupational hazard for commercial fishermen. The case became a precedent-setting legal battle that drew attention from labor lawyers and workers' compensation specialists around the country, ultimately resulting in a settlement that provided medical coverage and disability payments but took more than a year to finalize. As winter settled over Kodiak Island, the Turner brothers faced the longest season of their lives. For the first time in decades, they would not be preparing boats and equipment for the spring fishing season, would not be planning for the salmon runs that had defined their yearly rhythm since childhood. Instead, they faced months of continued medical treatment, physical therapy, and the slow process of deciding what direction their lives would take in the aftermath of an encounter that had changed everything. Jacob's physical recovery continued to be slow and incomplete. Despite multiple surgeries and intensive therapy, his left arm remained significantly impaired, with limited range of motion and reduced strength that would prevent him from performing many of the physically demanding tasks required in commercial fishing. The nerve damage had left him with chronic pain and numbness that affected his sleep and his ability to concentrate, complications that extended far beyond the obvious physical limitations. The psychological healing proved even more challenging. Both brothers found themselves suffering from what psychologists term complicated grief, a form of trauma response that occurs when a person loses not just a loved one, but an entire way of life. The ocean that had sustained their family for generations now seemed like an alien and hostile environment, populated by predators capable of violence that defied rational understanding. The simple sound of waves could trigger panic attacks, and the smell of fish brought back memories of blood and terror, Professional counseling helped, but progress was measured in small increments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, worked with both brothers to develop coping strategies and slowly rebuild their confidence in their ability to control their environment. The process was complicated by the fact that their trauma was tied to their livelihood, making it impossible to simply avoid triggers the way victims of car accidents might avoid driving. Samuel proved more adaptable to the psychological challenges than his older brother, perhaps because his physical injuries were less severe and his recovery more complete. He began exploring alternative career paths, including the possibility of working for the Coast Guard or Fish and Game Department, where his knowledge of local waters and fishing operations would be valuable assets. The idea of helping prevent other tragedies, like the one that had befallen his family, gave him a sense of purpose that aided his psychological recovery. But for Jacob, the path forward remained unclear. Fishing had been more than just a job. It had been his identity, his connection to his father and grandfather, his way of understanding his place in the world. The loss of that identity was as devastating as any physical injury, creating a sense of purposelessness that no amount of medical treatment could address. He found himself mourning not just his injured arm, but the entire life he had planned to live, the fishing seasons he would never experience, the knowledge and traditions he would never pass on to his own children. The community's support continued throughout the winter months, but both brothers understood that such assistance could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, they would need to rebuild their lives and find new sources of income, new ways of defining themselves that did not depend on the ocean that had betrayed them so catastrophically. The challenge was finding paths forward that honored their past while acknowledging the reality of their changed circumstances. Spring arrived early in 2025, and with it came the familiar stirring of activity as Kodiak's fishing fleet prepared for another season. For the Turner brothers, watching from shore as boats they had known for decades headed out to waters they could no longer work, was a painful reminder of how completely their lives had been altered. The sight of other fishermen preparing nets and checking equipment brought back memories of their own preparations, of the excitement and anticipation that had once marked the beginning of each new season. Jacob made several attempts to return to the water, accepting invitations to accompany friends on short trips that might help him overcome his psychological barriers to being at sea. But each attempt ended in panic attacks and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability that made clear his fishing days were over. The ocean that had once felt like home now seemed like an alien landscape populated by invisible threats, a place where massive predators might emerge from the depths without warning to destroy everything he valued. Samuel's recovery progressed more successfully, and by late spring he had accepted a position with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a field technician specializing in marine mammal and bear interactions. The job would allow him to use his maritime experience while contributing to research that might prevent future tragedies. His first assignment involved collecting data on bear behavior in fishing areas, work that brought him full circle to confront the creatures that had nearly destroyed his family while using that experience to protect others. The first anniversary of the attack approached with a mixture of reflection and determination on the part of both brothers. They had survived an encounter that by all rights should have killed them both, had endured months of physical and psychological recovery, and had begun to build new lives from the wreckage of their old ones. The process had been neither quick nor easy, but it had demonstrated a resilience that even they had not known they possessed. On October 21, 2025, exactly 1 year after the attack, Both brothers returned to Larsen Bay for the first time since that terrible day. They came not in a fishing boat, but in a Coast Guard vessel, accompanying Dr. Stevens and other researchers who were conducting a follow-up study of bear behavior in the area. For Jacob, the trip was an attempt to face his demons and reclaim some measure of peace with the waters that had shaped his life. For Samuel, it was part of his new job and his commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The bay looked much the same as it had a year earlier, its waters calm and deceptively peaceful in the autumn sunshine. Bears were visible on the shore, fishing for salmon in the same waters where the Turner brothers had nearly died, their presence a reminder that the wilderness remained as wild and unpredictable as ever. But there was something different about seeing these animals from the safety of a larger vessel, surrounded by colleagues and researchers, rather than alone and vulnerable as they had been that terrible day. "It's strange," Samuel commented as they anchored near the spot where the Sarah's Dream had gone down, her remains now part of the bay's ecosystem, slowly being colonized by marine life that would eventually erase all traces of the tragedy. "It doesn't look like a place where something like that could happen. It looks like any other fishing ground," and indeed it did, giving no hint of the violence it had witnessed or the lives it had forever changed. Jacob said little during the visit, but his presence spoke volumes about his determination to overcome the trauma that had ruled his life for a year. Standing on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter, watching bears fish in waters that had nearly become his grave, he felt something like peace beginning to return. The terror would always be part of him. The scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal, but for the first time since the attack, he felt something approaching acceptance of what had happened and hope for what might still be possible. Dr. Stevens's research that day added another piece to the puzzle of the bear attack, though it did not provide the complete explanation that everyone hoped for. Underwater cameras had documented unusual feeding behavior among bears in the bay, including instances of bears following fishing boats at distances that suggested learned behavior rather than simple curiosity. While no other bears had attempted to board vessels, the research suggested that the Turner brothers' attacker might not have been as unique as initially believed. The study's recommendations included increased awareness among fishermen about the potential for bear interactions in certain high-activity areas, improved emergency communication equipment for boats operating in remote areas, and continued monitoring of bear behavior to identify potential problems before they escalated to violence. While such measures could not prevent all attacks, they might reduce the risk and improve survival chances for those who found themselves in similar situations. As the research vessel headed back to Kodiak that evening, both Turner brothers reflected on how much their lives had changed in the past year. They had lost their boat, their livelihood, and their sense of security, but they had gained something as well. A deeper understanding of their own resilience and the importance of the community that had supported them through their darkest hours. The attack had ended one chapter of their lives, but it had also begun another, one that would be defined not by what they had lost, but by how they chose to rebuild. The fishing industry in Alaska continued much as it had before the attack, with boats heading out each day to harvest the ocean's bounty from waters that remained as beautiful and dangerous as ever. But the story of the Turner brothers had become part of the collective memory of the fleet, a reminder that the wilderness they worked in was governed by forces that could not be completely controlled or predicted. Their survival had become a testament to human resilience and the importance of being prepared for the unthinkable. In the months that followed, both brothers continued their recovery and their new careers, Samuel as a researcher and Jacob as a consultant, helping other trauma survivors navigate the long process of rebuilding their lives. Their story had become a case study in survival psychology, used by therapists and counselors to help other victims of animal attacks understand that recovery was possible even from the most devastating encounters. The bear that had attacked them remained a mystery, its motivations known only to the wilderness that had produced it. But its legacy lived on in the scars it had left, the lives it had changed, and the lessons learned from an encounter that had tested the limits of human survival and demonstrated the complex relationship between predator and prey that continued to define life in Alaska's coastal waters. As winter returned to Kodiak Island, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of storms and shorter days, both Turner brothers faced their second winter away from the fishing fleet with greater equanimity than they had thought possible. They had learned that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant finding new ways to live with purpose and meaning, even when the old ways were no longer possible. The ocean that had nearly killed them remained part of their world, but it no longer defined the limits of what they could become. The story of their encounter with the massive Kodiak bear would be told and retold for years to come, becoming part of the folklore of Alaska's fishing community and a reminder that in the wilderness, humans remain vulnerable to forces that dwarf their technology and their plans. But more than a cautionary tale, it had become a story of resilience, of the human capacity to survive the unsurvivable and find new meaning in the aftermath of loss. The blood that had stained the waters of Larsen Bay on that October day had long since been washed away by the tides, but the memory of what had happened there would endure, serving as both warning and inspiration for all who ventured into the vast wilderness of Alaska's coastal waters, where beauty and danger existed in eternal balance, and where the line between life and death could be crossed in the span of a heartbeat. The next stories. When the ice breaks. The bitter wind howled across the tundra, with a ferocity that seemed to cut through every layer of protection the rescue team had wrapped around themselves. January 29th, 2025, had dawned with deceptively clear skies over Barrow, Alaska, but by noon, the weather had turned treacherous. Susan Green pulled her radio closer to her mouth, her breath forming ice crystals on the device as she spoke. "Base, this is Rescue 7. We're approximately 3 miles northeast of the last known position. Wind speed is picking up, visibility dropping, no sign of the missing party yet." She paused, listening to the static-filled response from headquarters. At 41, Susan had seen enough Alaska rescues to know when conditions were deteriorating faster than predicted. Behind her, officers Jake Morrison and Elena Vasquez were setting up the emergency shelter, their movements efficient despite the numbing cold. Jake, a 15-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers, had requested to join this search specifically because his own brother had gone missing on these same trails 5 years earlier. They'd found him 3 days later, hypothermic but alive. Jake carried that experience like a talisman, believing it made him better at finding others. Elena, newer to Alaska but not to survival situations, had grown up in Montana's backcountry. Her grandmother had been Blackfeet, and Elena carried traditional knowledge alongside her modern training. She'd noticed things the others missed, the way the snow pattern suggested wildlife movement, the subtle signs that this area was more active than their briefings had indicated. The missing skiers, the Kowalski family from Anchorage, had set out 4 days ago for what was supposed to be a 2-day winter camping expedition. Martin Kowalski, 45, was an experienced outdoorsman, but his 16-year-old daughter Amy was relatively new to winter wilderness camping. His wife Jennifer had stayed home, and now she waited by the phone in a hotel room in Barrow, checking in with rescue coordination every hour. Dr. Michael Trent, the team's survival medicine specialist, emerged from behind the shelter adjusting his pack. At 52, he'd seen more wilderness trauma than most emergency room doctors see in their entire careers. He'd volunteered for this mission because hypothermia cases had a narrow window for successful treatment, and every hour mattered. "The wind's shifting," Dr. Trent called out, his voice muffled by his balaclava. "Coming from the north now. That's going to drive any wildlife further south, possibly into our search area." Ranger Thomas Akutchuk nodded grimly. As an Inupiat native and 20-year veteran of the Arctic wilderness, Thomas understood the land and its dangers better than anyone on the team. He'd been tracking polar bear activity in this region for months, noting that climate changes were pushing them further inland in search of food. The bears were hungrier, more desperate, and more likely to view humans as potential prey. "We need to stay alert," Thomas said quietly to the group. "The tracks I found this morning were fresh." Large male, probably 8 to 9 feet tall when standing. He's been following the coast, but with this wind shift he might move inland. Communications specialist Maria Santos checked her equipment one more time. At 28, she was the youngest member of the team, but her technology expertise made her invaluable. Her job was to maintain contact with base camp, coordinate with air support, and ensure that if something went wrong, help could find them quickly. She'd grown up in New Mexico and had only been in Alaska for 2 years, but she'd trained extensively for cold weather operations. The 6th member of their team was pilot Dave Chen, who'd landed them at the search area that morning and was now waiting with the helicopter in a sheltered position 2 miles away. Dave had been flying in Alaska for 12 years and had probably saved more lives than any other single person in the northern regions. His helicopter was their lifeline, but the weather window for extraction was rapidly narrowing. As they prepared to move deeper into the search area, none of them fully grasped that they were walking into a convergence of circumstances that would test every aspect of their training, teamwork, and will to survive. The missing Kowalski family had last been seen on January 26th at the Barrow Ranger Station, where they'd filed their backcountry permit and received the standard weather briefing. Martin Kowalski had seemed confident, perhaps overconfident, according to the ranger who'd processed their paperwork. Amy Kowalski had appeared excited but nervous, asking multiple questions about wildlife encounters and emergency procedures. Their planned route would take them along the coastal trails for the first day, then inland toward a series of emergency shelters maintained by the Park Service. The weather had been favorable when they'd started, with temperatures around -10 Fahrenheit and light winds. But by January 28th, when they'd failed to check in as scheduled, conditions had deteriorated significantly. The polar bear that Ranger Akutchuk had been tracking was a 15-year-old male, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds. Polar bears typically avoided human contact, but this particular animal had been exhibiting unusual behavior for several weeks. Climate change had disrupted the ice patterns he relied on for hunting seals, forcing him to travel greater distances in search of food. He'd gone nearly 3 weeks without a substantial meal, and hunger was making him increasingly bold and unpredictable. The bear had first encountered human scent near the coast 2 days earlier, following the trail left by the Kowalski family. Unlike brown bears or black bears, polar bears had no instinctual fear of humans. To this apex predator, humans represented a potential food source, especially when the bear was hungry and desperate. Susan Green checked her GPS coordinates against the search grid they'd been assigned. The team was responsible for covering a 4-square-mile area of tundra and coastal terrain, working in a systematic pattern that would bring them to each emergency shelter and known camping spot in the region. So far, they'd found no sign of the missing family. "Base, this is Rescue 7, Susan spoke into her radio again. "We're approaching grid section Charlie 4. Wind speed now approximately 45 miles per hour, temperature dropping to -28. Request weather update and estimated time window for helicopter extraction." The response crackled through the static. "Rescue 7, weather window closing rapidly." Advise completion of current grid search within 90 minutes for safe extraction. Storm front approaching from the northwest. Dr. Trent had been monitoring the radio traffic while checking his medical supplies. He carried enough equipment to treat severe hypothermia, trauma, and shock, but he knew that in these conditions, their best chance of saving anyone was to get them to proper medical facilities as quickly as possible. The nearest hospital was in Barrow, with a flight time of 25 minutes under good conditions. Officer Morrison had taken point position as they moved across the frozen landscape. His radio was set to the emergency frequency, and he carried both standard law enforcement gear and specialized rescue equipment. Behind him, Officer Vasquez was documenting their search pattern with both GPS coordinates and detailed notes about terrain and conditions. The team had been walking for 45 minutes when Ranger Akuchuk suddenly raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He'd spotted something in the snow ahead. Tracks that were too large to be human, too fresh to be old. Bear tracks, Thomas said quietly, kneeling next to the prints in the snow. Male polar bear, probably 1,200 pounds or more. These were made within the last 2 hours. He stood up slowly, scanning the horizon in all directions. He's been following a human trail. The realization hit the team immediately. If the bear was following human tracks, and those tracks were recent, they might belong to the missing Kowalski family, but it also meant they were potentially walking into an active predator situation. Dr. Trent moved closer to examine the tracks. How dangerous is this situation, realistically? I mean, what are the actual statistics on polar bear attacks? Thomas's expression was grave. Polar bears are the only bear species that actively hunts humans as prey. Brown bears and black bears usually attack in defense or when surprised. Polar bears see us as food, especially when they're hungry. He pointed to scuff marks in the snow around the bear tracks. This one has been investigating something, probably human scent. He's hunting. Communications specialist Santos immediately began transmitting their situation to base camp. Base, this is Rescue 7. We have confirmed polar bear activity in our search area. Large male, recent tracks, appears to be following human trail. Requesting immediate advice on protocol and extraction options. The response was swift but not reassuring. Rescue 7. Air support cannot safely extract in current wind conditions. Storm front arriving ahead of schedule. Recommend moving to nearest emergency shelter and maintaining defensive position until conditions improve. Susan Green made the command decision that would determine everything that followed. We continue the search, but we stay together. We stay alert, and we're prepared for contact. The Kowalski family might still be alive, and if that bear finds them before we do, they won't be. Officer Morrison checked his weapon, a .45-70 rifle loaded with hard-cast bullets specifically designed for large predator defense. Officer Vasquez carried bear spray and a backup .44 Magnum. Each member of the team had been trained in polar bear encounter protocols, but training and reality were vastly different things. As they continued following the tracks, Dr. Trent reviewed the medical procedures for bear attack treatment. Massive trauma, blood loss, potential for severed arteries, compound fractures and shock. These were the injuries he'd need to be prepared to treat in sub-zero conditions with limited supplies and possibly while under continued threat. The emergency shelter they were heading toward was a small reinforced structure designed to withstand Arctic storms. It contained basic supplies, a radio, and emergency heat sources. More importantly, it had thick walls and a door that could be barricaded against wildlife. If they could reach it before the storm hit, they'd have a defensible position. But the tracks in the snow were leading them in the same direction, suggesting that either the missing family or the bear, or both, had also been heading toward the shelter. Ranger Akuchuk had been reading the story told in the snow like a book. The bear tracks showed a purposeful, hunting gait. The animal was following something specific, and its behavior indicated focused predatory intent. Mixed in with the bear tracks were human footprints, 2 different sizes, suggesting an adult and a teenager. "The family made it this far," Thomas announced to the team. "Adult male, size 11 or 12 boots. Smaller person, probably the daughter. They were moving toward the shelter, but—" He paused, studying the pattern more carefully. They were being followed. The bear was maybe 50 yards behind them. The timeline was becoming clearer and more urgent. The Kowalski family had likely reached this point sometime the day before, possibly seeking shelter from the approaching storm. The bear had been tracking them, possibly for hours, waiting for the right moment to attack. Officer Vasquez spotted something ahead that made her blood run cold. "There," she said, pointing to a disturbed area in the snow about 100 yards from their position. Something happened there. As they approached the site, the story became unmistakably clear. The snow was trampled and stained with blood. Scattered around the area were torn pieces of fabric, a broken trekking pole, and an overturned backpack with its contents spilled across the frozen ground. Dr. Trent immediately began examining the scene from a medical perspective. "Multiple blood trails," he announced grimly. "At least 2 people injured. The amount of blood suggests serious trauma." He followed one of the trails with his eyes. One person was dragged approximately 30 feet in that direction. Susan Green felt the weight of command settle heavily on her shoulders. They'd found evidence of the attack they'd all feared, but they still didn't know if anyone had survived or where the survivors might be now. Communications specialist Santos was frantically trying to reach base camp, but the increasing wind was creating interference with their radio signals. "Base, this is Rescue 7. We have found evidence of bear attack at coordinates." The transmission cut into static. The storm was arriving faster than predicted, and visibility was dropping rapidly. Snow began falling in thick, wind-driven sheets that made it difficult to see more than 20 feet in any direction. They needed to find shelter immediately, but they also needed to continue searching for survivors. Officer Morrison made a discovery that changed everything. "Blood trail leads toward the emergency shelter," he called out. "Someone made it that far." He pointed through the swirling snow toward a dark shape, barely visible in the distance. The emergency shelter was a squat, reinforced building designed to withstand the worst Arctic weather. As they approached, they could see that the door was partially open, hanging at an odd angle. Snow had drifted inside, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. Dr. Trent was the first to enter the shelter, his medical training taking precedence over safety protocols. Inside, he found more blood, makeshift bandages created from torn clothing, and evidence that someone had attempted emergency medical treatment. "Someone survived the initial attack," he announced to the team. "Whoever was here tried to treat serious injuries. There's a significant amount of blood loss, but the bleeding was controlled to some degree." He examined the bandages more closely. These wounds were probably to the arms and legs, defensive injuries consistent with a bear attack. Ranger Akutchuk examined the shelter from a different perspective. "The bear was here too," he said quietly. "Claw marks on the doorframe, scent marks. He found them." Thomas paused, reading the signs that only his experience could interpret. But he didn't get inside. The door held. The implications were both hopeful and terrifying. Someone from the Kowalski family had survived the initial attack and reached the shelter. They'd managed to keep the bear out, at least temporarily. But where were they now, and were they still alive? Outside, the storm was rapidly reaching blizzard conditions. The wind was howling at 60 miles per hour, and the temperature was dropping toward -35 Fahrenheit. Visibility was near zero, and any chance of helicopter extraction had disappeared entirely. Susan Green made another command decision. "We secure this shelter and wait out the storm. We treat this as a potential crime scene and preserve evidence, but our priority is survival. She looked around at her team. If there are survivors out there, we can't help them if we're dead. Officer Vasquez began barricading the damaged door, while Officer Morrison established a watch schedule. Dr. Trent organized his medical supplies and prepared for the possibility that they might need to treat bear attack injuries. Communications specialist Santos worked to establish any kind of radio contact with the outside world. Ranger Akuchuk continued reading the signs around the shelter. The story he was piecing together was complex and troubling. The bear had definitely been here, probably within the last 12 hours. But there were also signs that humans had left the shelter, possibly that morning. They left on foot, Thomas announced to the group. 2 people, moving together. One was injured but mobile. They headed northeast toward the coast. He paused, considering the implications. That was before the storm hit, but after the bear had been here. The question that haunted everyone was why the survivors would leave the relative safety of the shelter to venture out into the Arctic wilderness. Dr. Trent suggested that if someone was seriously injured, they might have made a desperate decision to try to reach help rather than wait for rescue. Officer Morrison had a darker theory. Maybe the bear didn't give up. Maybe it was waiting outside, and they felt they had no choice but to run. As night fell and the storm raged around them, the rescue team found themselves in a situation they'd never fully prepared for. They were isolated, cut off from outside help, in the territory of an active predator, searching for survivors who might already be dead. Dr. Trent used the time to review everything he knew about polar bear attack injuries. Unlike other bear species, polar bears typically attack to kill and consume their prey. Survivors of polar bear attacks were extremely rare, and when they did occur, the injuries were usually devastating. The most common injuries included massive lacerations from claws that could be up to 4 inches long, crushing bite wounds from jaws that could exert over 1,200 pounds of pressure per square inch, and severe trauma from being shaken and thrown by an animal that could weigh 1,200 pounds or more. Treatment in the field was limited to controlling bleeding, preventing shock, and providing pain relief. The real challenge was keeping someone alive long enough to reach surgical facilities, especially in sub-zero conditions where hypothermia became an additional threat. Ranger Akuchuk shared his knowledge of polar bear behavior with the team. "This isn't a normal situation," he explained. "Typically, a polar bear would make a quick kill and then feed immediately. The fact that survivors escaped suggests something disrupted the attack." Thomas had seen this pattern before, though rarely. Sometimes a bear attack was interrupted by noise, weather, or the intervention of other people. Sometimes the bear was injured or distracted, but in this case, the bear had clearly continued hunting, following the survivors to the shelter, and then waiting. "He's not going to give up," Thomas said quietly. "This bear has tasted human blood, and he's still hungry. He's going to keep hunting until he finds them." Outside the shelter, the storm continued to rage with unprecedented fury. The wind was creating snowdrifts that could bury a person within minutes. The temperature had dropped to -40 Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin within 5 minutes. Communications specialist Santos finally managed to establish intermittent radio contact with base camp. The news wasn't encouraging. The storm was expected to last at least 18 hours, possibly longer. No air support would be possible until it passed, and even ground support couldn't reach their position in these conditions. "We're on our own until tomorrow night at the earliest," she reported to the team. "Base camp knows our position, but they can't help us until the weather clears." Susan Green felt the full weight of leadership in that moment. 6 people under her command, trapped in a damaged shelter, with evidence that a deadly predator was active in the area. 2 missing civilians who might still be alive but were certainly in mortal danger. And a storm that had cut them off from any possibility of outside help. Officer Morrison had been monitoring the area around the shelter through the small window, using night vision equipment to watch for any sign of movement. "There's something out there," he announced suddenly. "Large shape, approximately 50 yards northeast of our position." Everyone in the shelter fell silent, straining to hear anything over the howling wind. Ranger Akutchuk moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. "That's him," he said quietly. "The bear." He's been waiting. The realization that they were being actively stalked by a polar bear transformed their situation from a rescue mission to a survival scenario. The bear had found their shelter, and it was patient enough to wait for an opportunity to attack. Dr. Trent checked his watch. It was 11:47 p.m. on January 29th. They'd been in the shelter for 6 hours, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The temperature was still dropping, and their heating sources were limited. "We need to assume the bear will attempt to get inside," Susan said, reviewing their defensive options. "The door is compromised, we have limited visibility, and we can't count on rescue until the storm passes." Officer Vasquez had been reinforcing the damaged door with equipment from their packs. "The door will hold against a normal attack, but polar bears are incredibly strong. If he really wants to get in here, he probably can." The team established a watch rotation, with 2 people awake at all times. Officer Morrison and Ranger Akutchuk took the first watch, both armed and positioned to cover the door and window. The others tried to rest, knowing that they might need all their strength before the night was over. At 12:23 a.m., the bear made its first approach. Officer Morrison saw it first, a massive white shape moving through the storm toward their shelter. "Contact," he whispered, alerting the others without making any sudden movements or loud noises. The bear approached slowly, deliberately, showing no fear or hesitation. It was larger than any of them had imagined, probably 9 feet tall when standing, with massive shoulders and paws the size of dinner plates. Even in the storm, its black nose and eyes were clearly visible as it investigated their shelter. Ranger Akutchuk had his rifle ready, but held his fire. "Don't shoot unless he tries to get inside," he whispered. "The noise might bring him straight to us, and we need to preserve ammunition." The bear circled the shelter twice, testing the structure and looking for weaknesses. It scraped at the walls with its claws, leaving deep gouges in the reinforced material. At one point, it stood on its hind legs and pressed against the roof, testing whether it could collapse the structure. After 20 minutes of investigation, the bear moved away, disappearing back into the storm. But everyone in the shelter knew it hadn't gone far. It was waiting, watching, planning its next approach. Dr. Trent used the brief respite to review their situation medically. "If anyone gets injured by this bear, we're looking at massive trauma that I'm not equipped to handle properly in these conditions." He organized his supplies one more time. "I can control bleeding, provide pain relief, and treat for shock, but anything more serious than that." The unspoken reality was that a serious bear attack in their current situation would likely be fatal. They were too far from medical facilities, in too harsh conditions, with too limited supplies to handle major trauma effectively. At 1:15 a.m., Officer Vasquez spotted movement to the east of their position. "There's something else out there," she reported, "too small to be the bear." Moving erratically, using night vision equipment, they could make out a human figure stumbling through the storm. Someone was walking toward their shelter, barely upright, clearly in distress. "It's one of the survivors," Dr. Trent said immediately. "We have to get them inside." But Ranger Akutchuk had a different perspective. The bear is still out there. If we open this door, we expose ourselves to attack. And if that person is badly injured, the scent of blood might draw the bear directly to us. Susan Green faced another impossible command decision. They couldn't leave a survivor outside to die in the storm, but opening the shelter might doom all of them to bear attack. Morrison, you and I will go out. Vasquez, you cover us from the door. Akuchuk, watch for the bear. Santos, be ready to get a radio message out if this goes bad. Dr. Trent grabbed his medical kit. I'm going too. If they're injured, they'll need immediate treatment. The three of them prepared to leave the relative safety of the shelter to attempt a rescue in the middle of an Arctic blizzard, while being stalked by a polar bear that had already killed at least once. Officer Morrison opened the door just enough for them to slip out. The wind immediately hit them like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces and making it almost impossible to see. The temperature shock was so severe that their exposed skin began to sting within seconds. The survivor was approximately 30 yards away, moving slowly through knee-deep snow. As they got closer, they could see it was a teenage girl, probably Amy Kowalski. She was wearing torn winter clothing, had visible injuries to her arms and face, and was clearly hypothermic. Dr. Trent reached her first. Amy Kowalski, can you hear me? The girl was conscious but barely responsive. Her skin was pale and cold, her speech slurred from both injury and cold exposure. Dad, she managed to whisper, Dad is... The bear. It came back. Susan Green and Officer Morrison established a defensive perimeter, while Dr. Trent began emergency treatment. Amy had defensive wounds on both arms, consistent with a bear attack. Her jacket was torn and bloodstained, and she showed signs of severe hypothermia. We need to get her inside immediately, Dr. Trent announced. She's got maybe minutes before hypothermia becomes irreversible. As they prepared to move back toward the shelter, Ranger Akuchuk's voice came through their radios. Bear approaching from the north. Big one, moving fast. Through the storm, they could see the massive white shape of the polar bear, now running toward them with the fluid, deadly grace of an apex predator. It had detected them the moment they'd left the shelter, and now it was closing the distance rapidly. Officer Morrison raised his rifle, but the storm made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The bear was still 50 yards away, but covering ground quickly through the deep snow. Get the girl to the shelter, Susan Green ordered. I'll cover your retreat. Dr. Trent and Officer Morrison began half carrying, half dragging Amy toward the shelter, while Susan maintained a defensive position. The bear was now 30 yards away and accelerating. Officer Vasquez had the shelter door open, providing covering fire with her backup weapon. Move! 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 She shouted over the wind. The bear was 20 yards away when Dr. Trent and Morrison reached the shelter door with Amy. Susan Green was backing toward the shelter, her weapon trained on the approaching predator. At 15 yards, the bear suddenly veered to the east, disappearing back into the storm as quickly as it had appeared. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had aged everyone involved by years. Once inside the shelter, Dr. Trent immediately began treating Amy's injuries. She had multiple lacerations on both arms, bite marks on her shoulder, and severe hypothermia. Her core body temperature was dangerously low, and she was showing signs of shock. Amy, can you tell us what happened to your father? Dr. Trent asked as he worked to warm her and treat her wounds. Her story came out in fragments, interrupted by shivering and pain, but it painted a clear picture of survival horror. The bear had attacked their camp while they slept. Her father had fought the animal off long enough for them to escape to the emergency shelter. But Martin Kowalski had been seriously injured in the attack. They'd spent a day and a night in the shelter, but her father's injuries were severe, and he was getting worse. That morning, despite the approaching storm, He'd decided to try to reach help, believing it was their only chance. "He made me stay," Amy whispered through chattering teeth, "said he'd bring back help. But the bear, it followed him. I heard." She couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were devastating. Martin Kowalski had left the shelter that morning, seriously injured, walking into a blizzard while being stalked by a polar bear. His chances of survival were essentially zero. Dr. Trent focused on saving the patient he had. Amy's injuries were serious but treatable if he could get her core temperature up and control the bleeding. He had warming packs, emergency blankets, and IV fluids that could help reverse the hypothermia. But they were still trapped in a damaged shelter, in the middle of a historic blizzard, being stalked by a predator that had now confirmed humans as prey. And somewhere out in the storm, Martin Kowalski was probably dying or already dead. Communications specialist Santos had been trying to establish radio contact to report their situation. "Base, this is Rescue 7. We have recovered one survivor, critical condition, hypothermic with bear attack injuries. We are still missing one adult male. Polar bear active in immediate area. Request immediate air support when weather permits." The response was barely audible through the storm interference. "Rescue 7, weather, 24 hours, hold position, medical." They were still on their own, but now they had a critically injured teenager who needed medical attention that exceeded their field capabilities. At 3:30 a.m., Amy's condition began to stabilize. Dr. Trent had successfully raised her core body temperature and controlled the bleeding from her wounds. She was conscious and able to communicate more clearly. Her account of the bear attack was detailed and terrifying. The animal had approached their camp silently around dawn on January 28th. Her father had awakened to find the bear investigating their tent. When Martin tried to scare it away, the bear had attacked immediately. "It was so fast," Amy said, still shivering despite the warming treatments. "1 second Dad was yelling at it, the next second it had him on the ground." She paused, reliving the trauma. "He fought it with the camp axe, hit it in the head. That's what made it let go." The detail about Martin hitting the bear with an axe explained some of the unusual behavior they'd observed. The bear had been injured in the initial attack, which might have made it more cautious, but also more aggressive. Amy described their escape to the emergency shelter, with her father bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, but still able to walk. They'd managed to barricade themselves inside, but the bear had found them within hours. "It tried to get in all night," she said, scratching at the door, pushing against the walls. "Dad kept the rifle pointed at the door, but we only had a few bullets." Ranger Akuchuk had been listening to Amy's account with growing concern. "An injured bear is even more dangerous than a normal one," he explained to the team. "It's in pain, it's angry, and it's learned that humans can hurt it. That makes it more likely to attack and less likely to retreat." The wounded bear explained why it had been so persistent in stalking the survivors. Most bears would have given up after the initial attack was disrupted, but this animal had been hurt and was now motivated by both hunger and revenge. At 4:15 a.m., they heard sounds outside the shelter that chilled everyone's blood, scratching, scraping, and the distinctive huffing sound of a large bear investigating something. The polar bear had returned, and this time it seemed determined to find a way inside. The sounds continued for over an hour. The bear tested every part of the shelter, looking for weaknesses. It scraped at the walls, pushed against the roof supports, and repeatedly tested the damaged door. Officer Morrison and Ranger Akuchuk maintained defensive positions, weapons ready, while the others stayed quiet and tried to keep Amy calm. The teenager was terrified, reliving the trauma of the original attack with every sound the bear made. At 5:47 a.m., the bear found what it was looking for. The shelter had been designed to withstand weather, not determined attack by a 1,200-pound predator. The bear discovered that by standing on its hind legs and pushing down on a specific section of the roof, it could create a gap where the wall met the ceiling. Snow began falling through the gap, followed by a massive white paw with claws extended. The bear was trying to tear its way through the roof of the shelter. "Contact!" Officer Morrison shouted, raising his rifle toward the gap. "It's coming through the roof!" Ranger Akutchuk positioned himself on the opposite side of the shelter, creating a crossfire position. "Don't shoot until you have a clear target. We can't waste ammunition." The bear's efforts to enlarge the gap were methodical and persistent. It would push and scrape for several minutes, then back off to assess its progress, then return to work on the weak point. Each cycle brought it closer to creating an opening large enough to climb through. Dr. Trent moved Amy to the far corner of the shelter, the position that would be safest if the bear managed to get inside. "If shooting starts, you stay low and don't move," he instructed her. "No matter what happens, don't try to run outside." Susan Green was making rapid calculations about their tactical situation. They had 3 rifles and limited ammunition. The shelter provided some protection, but was being systematically compromised. Outside conditions were still life-threatening, making escape impossible. At 6:12 a.m., the gap in the roof became large enough for the bear to fit its head through. For the first time, they could see their stalker clearly. A massive male polar bear with fresh scars on its face and head, probably from Martin Kowalski's axe. The bear's black eyes scanned the interior of the shelter, taking in the humans below. There was no fear in those eyes, only predatory calculation. It had found its prey, and now it was determining the best way to reach them. Officer Morrison had a clear shot at the bear's head, but Ranger Akutchuk gestured for him to wait. "One shot," Thomas whispered. "We might only get one clean shot. Make it count." The bear withdrew its head from the gap and resumed working to enlarge the opening. The sounds of splintering wood and tearing metal filled the shelter as the animal systematically destroyed their protection. Communications specialist Santos made one final attempt to reach base camp. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Rescue 7. Polar bear attack in progress. Grid coordinates." Static swallowed the rest of her transmission. At 6:23 a.m., the gap became large enough for the bear to begin climbing through. Its massive shoulders appeared in the opening as it started to lower itself into the shelter. Ranger Akutchuk fired first, a single shot aimed at the bear's head. The bullet struck the animal in the shoulder, causing it to roar and momentarily withdraw. Officer Morrison followed with a second shot that caught the bear in the chest. The wounded bear's roar was deafening in the confined space of the shelter. Instead of retreating, the animal became more aggressive, tearing at the opening with renewed fury. Officer Vasquez fired her third shot, and this one found its mark in the bear's neck. The animal shuddered, blood spraying from the wound, but it continued trying to get inside the shelter. "It's not going down!" Officer Morrison shouted over the bear's roars. "We need more firepower!" Dr. Trent pushed Amy further into the corner and prepared his medical supplies. If the bear got inside, there would be multiple casualties requiring immediate treatment. The bear managed to get both front paws through the gap and was pulling itself down into the shelter when Ranger Akutchuk fired his final shot. This bullet struck the animal in the head, and the massive body went limp, hanging halfway through the roof opening. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. The bear was dead, but its body was blocking the gap it had created, and blood was dripping steadily into the shelter. "Is everyone okay?" Susan Green called out, checking her team. "Sound off!" Everyone was physically unharmed, but the psychological impact of the encounter was evident on every face. They'd just survived a sustained attack by one of nature's most dangerous predators, and the evidence of that encounter was hanging above their heads. Dr. Trent immediately checked Amy's condition. The stress and adrenaline had caused her hypothermia symptoms to worsen, and she was showing signs of shock from reliving her trauma. Officer Morrison and Ranger Akutchuk worked together to secure the bear's body and prevent it from falling into the shelter. The animal was massive, easily the largest polar bear any of them had ever seen up close. "That's the one that killed Martin Kowalski," Ranger Akutchuk said quietly. "The scars on its face match Amy's description. This is the bear that's been hunting them." The immediate threat was over, but their situation remained critical. They were still trapped by the storm, now with a dead polar bear hanging through their roof and a teenager who needed advanced medical care. At 7:30 a.m., the storm finally began to show signs of weakening. Visibility improved slightly, and the wind decreased from hurricane force to merely severe. Communications specialist Santos was able to establish clear radio contact with Base Camp for the first time in hours. "Base, this is Rescue 7. Polar bear threat neutralized. One survivor recovered, critical condition. Still missing adult male Martin Kowalski. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation." The response was swift and reassuring. "Rescue 7, we have helicopters standing by. Weather window opening. ETA to your position 35 minutes. Prepare for medical evacuation and crime scene preservation." Dr. Trent began preparing Amy for helicopter transport. Her injuries were stabilized, but she needed surgical repair of the bear attack wounds and continued treatment for hypothermia. More importantly, she needed psychological support for the trauma she'd experienced. As they waited for extraction, Ranger Akutchuk examined the dead bear more carefully. It was indeed a massive male, probably 15 to 20 years old. The scars on its head were fresh, confirming that Martin Kowalski had wounded it during the initial attack. "This bear was desperate," Thomas explained to the team. "Probably hadn't eaten in weeks. Climate change has been disrupting their normal hunting patterns. When they can't find seals, they start looking at humans as alternative prey." The helicopter's approach was audible long before it became visible through the clearing storm. The sound of rotors cutting through Arctic air had never been more welcome to any of them. Pilot Dave Chen's voice came through their radios. "Rescue 7, this is Arctic 1. I have visual on your position. Preparing for landing. Wind is still gusting to 40 miles per hour, so this is going to be a quick pickup." The helicopter landing was a complex operation in the residual storm conditions. Dave Chen had to hover just above the ground while the team loaded Amy onto a stretcher and prepared to evacuate. Dr. Trent accompanied Amy on the helicopter, continuing her medical treatment during the 25-minute flight to Barrow Regional Hospital. The others remained at the scene to preserve evidence and continue searching for Martin Kowalski. At the hospital, Amy was immediately taken to the emergency department, where a trauma team was waiting. Her injuries required surgery to repair damaged muscles and tendons in her arms, but the prognosis was good for full recovery. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, the emergency department director, had seen bear attack injuries before, but Amy's case was particularly challenging because of the combined trauma and hypothermia. "She's lucky to be alive," Dr. Mackenzie told Dr. Trent. "Another hour in those conditions, and she would have been beyond help." While Amy was in surgery, Dr. Trent contacted her mother, Jennifer Kowalski, who had been waiting in agony for news about her family. The conversation was heartbreaking. Relief that Amy was alive, devastation about Martin's presumed death. Back at the shelter site, the remaining team members had begun the grim task of searching for Martin Kowalski's body. The storm had covered most tracks, but Ranger Akutchuk was able to follow Amy's route back from the shelter to determine the direction her father might have taken. Officer Morrison documented the attack site and the dead bear for the official investigation. Wildlife authorities would need detailed evidence to understand how and why the attack had occurred, and whether other bears in the area posed similar threats. The search for Martin Kowalski resumed as soon as weather conditions permitted. Additional helicopters and search teams were brought in, using thermal imaging equipment to scan the vast area where he might have collapsed. At 2:15 p.m. on January 30th, Ranger Akutchuk found what they'd all been dreading. Martin Kowalski's body was discovered approximately 2 miles from the emergency shelter, partially buried by snow. He had made it much further than anyone had expected, given the severity of his injuries. The evidence suggested that Martin had survived for several hours after leaving the shelter, but had ultimately succumbed to blood loss and hypothermia. His body showed extensive bear attack injuries, but also signs that he'd fought to survive as long as possible. Dr. Trent performed a preliminary examination of the body for the investigation. Martin Kowalski had suffered massive trauma to his torso and limbs, consistent with a prolonged bear attack. But he'd also shown remarkable determination, fashioning a makeshift splint for a broken arm and continuing to walk despite wounds that would have incapacitated most people. He knew he was dying, Dr. Trent reported to the team, but he kept going anyway. Probably thought if he could reach help, his daughter might be saved. The recovery of Martin's body brought closure to the search operation, but it also marked the beginning of a comprehensive investigation into the circumstances that had led to Alaska's deadliest polar bear attack in decades. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster arrived from Anchorage to examine the dead bear and assess the broader situation. Her preliminary findings were disturbing. The bear had been underweight and showed signs of prolonged starvation, supporting the theory that climate change was driving these animals to more desperate behavior. "This won't be the last incident like this," Dr. Foster warned. "As Arctic ice patterns continue to change, we're going to see more polar bears moving inland in search of food. Some of them will view humans as prey." The investigation also revealed systemic issues with emergency communications in the region. The storm had disabled multiple radio repeaters, leaving the rescue team isolated for critical hours. Recommendations were made for improved backup communication systems and faster response protocols. Amy Kowalski spent 5 days in Barrow Regional Hospital before being transferred to a specialized trauma center in Anchorage. Her physical injuries healed well, but the psychological trauma would require months of therapy and support. In interviews with investigators, Amy provided detailed accounts of both the bear attack and her father's heroic efforts to save her. Her testimony became crucial evidence in understanding polar bear behavior and developing new safety protocols for Arctic activities. The media coverage of the incident was extensive, bringing national attention to the growing problem of human polar bear conflicts in Alaska. Environmental groups used the tragedy to highlight the connection between climate change and wildlife behavior, while hunting organizations called for more aggressive bear management policies. For the rescue team members, the psychological impact of the incident was profound and lasting. Each of them had been forced to confront their own mortality while trying to save others. The experience bonded them together, but also left them with trauma that would require professional support to overcome. Susan Green found herself questioning every decision she'd made during the crisis. Had they responded quickly enough? Could they have saved Martin Kowalski if they'd done something differently? The second-guessing was relentless and debilitating. Officer Morrison struggled with nightmares about the bear attack, reliving the moment when the massive predator had tried to break into their shelter. He took extended leave from the state troopers and underwent counseling for post-traumatic stress. Officer Vasquez channeled her experience into advocacy, working with wildlife authorities to develop better training programs for law enforcement officers who might encounter dangerous wildlife situations. Dr. Trent wrote extensively about the medical challenges of treating trauma in extreme cold weather conditions. His recommendations led to improved field medical kits and training protocols for wilderness emergency medicine. Communications specialist Santos left Alaska 6 months after the incident. unable to continue working in an environment that reminded her daily of their hours of isolation and helplessness. Ranger Akuchuk remained in his position, but became an advocate for increased polar bear research and monitoring. His traditional knowledge, combined with his experience during the attack, made him a valuable resource for understanding human-wildlife conflicts. Pilot Dave Chen continued flying rescue missions, but pushed for improved weather forecasting and communication systems that might prevent future teams from being trapped in similar situations. The incident led to comprehensive policy changes in Alaska's wilderness rescue protocols. New requirements were established for polar bear safety training, communication backup systems, and rapid response capabilities in bear country. Amy Kowalski returned to school in Anchorage, but struggled with anxiety and depression related to her trauma. She became an advocate for wilderness safety education, speaking to groups about the importance of understanding and respecting Arctic wildlife. Her mother, Jennifer Kowalski, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state, arguing that inadequate warning systems and emergency response capabilities had contributed to her husband's death. The case was settled out of court, with the state agreeing to implement improved safety measures. The polar bear's body was examined extensively by wildlife biologists and veterinarians. The analysis confirmed that the animal had been starving and had sustained previous injuries that might have affected its ability to hunt normally. Climate data showed that the sea ice patterns the bear depended on had been disrupted for several consecutive years. Environmental scientists used the incident as a case study in the broader effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. The disruption of polar bear hunting patterns was having cascading effects throughout the region, increasing the likelihood of human-wildlife conflicts. A year after the attack, a memorial was erected near Barrow for Martin Kowalski and other victims of wildlife encounters in Alaska. The memorial serves as both a tribute to those who died and a reminder of the dangers inherent in Arctic wilderness activities. The emergency shelter, where the rescue team had fought for their lives, was rebuilt and reinforced to better withstand both weather and wildlife encounters. New shelters constructed throughout the region incorporated lessons learned from the attack. Amy Kowalski graduated from high school with honors and enrolled in a wildlife biology program, motivated by her experience to study the animals that had changed her life so dramatically. Her father's memory inspired her to pursue work that might prevent similar tragedies. 2 years after the incident, polar bear attacks in Alaska increased by 30%, supporting Dr. Foster's prediction that climate change would continue to drive these conflicts. New management strategies were implemented to reduce human-bear encounters while preserving the animal's protected status. The rescue team members gradually returned to their normal duties, but none of them forgot the lessons learned during those terrifying hours in the Arctic shelter. Their experience became a training case study for rescue operations throughout Alaska and other polar regions. The psychological support services available to first responders were expanded significantly following the incident. The trauma experienced by the rescue team highlighted the need for better mental health resources for people who regularly face life-threatening situations in their work. Dr. Mackenzie at Barrow Regional Hospital led efforts to improve trauma care capabilities in remote Alaska locations. The challenges of treating Amy's injuries in a small hospital led to new protocols for transferring critical patients and providing advanced care in isolated communities. 5 years after the attack, Amy Kowalski completed her degree in wildlife biology and began working with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on polar bear research projects. Her unique perspective as both a scientist and a survivor gave her insights that proved valuable in developing human-wildlife conflict prevention strategies. The incident remained a defining moment for everyone involved, a stark reminder of the power of nature and the thin line between survival and tragedy in Alaska's wilderness. But it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of training, teamwork, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of that January night in 2025 continued to influence Arctic safety protocols, wildlife management policies, and rescue operations throughout Alaska and beyond. The courage shown by Martin Kowalski in sacrificing himself for his daughter, and by the rescue team in facing down a deadly predator, became part of Alaska's folklore of survival and heroism. In the end, the tragedy served as a catalyst for positive changes that would protect future generations of wilderness enthusiasts and the first responders who risked their lives to save them. The price paid for those improvements was measured in lives lost and trauma endured, but the lessons learned ensured that Martin Kowalski's sacrifice and his daughter's survival would have lasting meaning. The Arctic wilderness remained as beautiful and dangerous as ever, but the humans who ventured into it were better prepared for its challenges because of what happened during those hours when the ice broke and the line between predator and prey disappeared in the howling wind of an Alaska blizzard.